Let's create a skyscraper. I'm going to switch to our modeling workspace, tab back to object mode, and spend a couple minutes reorganizing some things in our outliner. So far, we've been putting everything into the standalone collection, which makes less sense as we've created things like our street section. So I think I'm going to create a new collection in the assets collection called ground. We'll take our street collections, throw them into ground. And also in our assets, we'll create another collection for our buildings. All right, so we can hide, let's see, our ground, our standalone, and let's bring back our city template. All right, so Shift-C. I'm also going to kind of refresh our 3D cursor so it's at the world origin for us to add a new mesh cube. And right away, I'm going to tab into edit mode GZ1. So we just move it flat on the ground plane. And let's talk about dimensions. So remember that our skyscrapers are kind of background buildings. They're going to be concentrated mostly along the outskirts of our city chunk here. So I think the default 2x2x2 is a good like small building, but I want to make this large. So we're going to change it to 4x4x8. All right, that's going to take up a lot more space, which skyscrapers tend to do. Now I can kind of hide everything except my human ref and my building. So we'll select those two objects, hit the / key to go into local view, and let's move our human kind of to the front of our building here. And there's a couple ways that we can start this. I like to begin by establishing kind of a floor height. But also you can decide, is the building flat on the ground or is it raised a little bit? Often you see buildings raised off the ground with stairs leading up to it. So I think for the skyscraper, I am going to do that, kind of give not a super grand staircase, but a grander staircase than our residential buildings might have. So I'm going to tab into edit mode on our building, Control R, let's cut an edge loop and slide it down a little bit over halfway the height of our human height. And then I'm going to tab back to object mode and go to wireframe GZ, and let's move our human ref to sit on that line. Okay, so this is like the actual first floor ground. All right, tab back into edit mode for our cube, and let's cut another edge. And I want this to be about twice the size of our human. All right, so the first floor is often a little higher ceilings, a little more grand. And then let's move that up. And now this is the ground of our second floor, where the height is going to be a little more normal, 8 feet, something like that. So I'm going to cut a new edge, and we're going to slide this down. And the way I kind of imagine this is, this is our human ref top of the head. And if you take your arms and hold them up, that's about how high the ceiling is, at least, when you're 6 feet tall. These don't have to be super precise. I'm really just keeping it from being arbitrary because that is definitely a problem. But as long as we build all our buildings similar to this, then it all should fit together pretty well. I think I might make this just a little bit higher. Okay, so now we have the ground floor, the first floor, and I'm going to separate this first floor. Alt-clicking to select the row of faces, hit Y. Actually, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to hit P and separate by selection so it becomes its own object. The reason being is we're going to lean on an array modifier for this majority section of our buildings that can be duplicated. So if we add the array and go immediately to the factor or the relative offset factor, by default it goes 1 unit of relative offset in the x-axis, but we want to turn that to 0 and instead change the z to 1. All right, so this uses the dimensions of the mesh island and allows us to repeat that as many times as we set the count to. All right, so I think if we get something close to maybe 10, okay, yeah, that's gonna get us pretty close to that, 8 meter dimension in the z-axis. And what's nice about the array, like the mirror modifier, is that we only have to focus on that first layer. We get the rest for free. Speaking of mirror modifier, we might as well take advantage of that as well. Control R to cut an edge down the middle of the front and the side, and we'll delete all verts except that corner. All right, now we can add a mirror modifier to stack these modifiers. Mirror first will go in the X and the Y axis. All right, so now we're getting the maximum output for the minimum input. I say that a lot, just working smarter rather than harder. Now let's start to build up some kind of depth layering that you've heard me talk about. So first, I'm going to create just a little bit of separation between the vertical levels. So Control R, let's cut 2 edges horizontally, and then right click so they don't slide anywhere, SZ, and we're going to scale them according to their median point so that there's just a little bit left over on the edges right there. And then Control R, let's cut another edge vertically on both sides. Right clicking so I don't slide them around. We're keeping them very evenly spaced, always cutting directly in the middle. And then in edge select mode, let's Shift Alt click so we get both of those edges and Control B. I'm just going to create a little column here by beveling that out, and then E to extrude, right click, Alt S, and we're going to push it out slightly. And you can see with the array modifier how that continues the shape all the way up. So now we've got just that little extra bit of depth. Now let's take it to another level with the windows, but first I want to separate these meshes out so they're a little easier to work with. So with the faces we just extruded, Control plus to select essentially the whole column, and I'm going to hit Y, leaving it part of this mesh but just separating it. And we can get rid of those unnecessary edges right here. Shift Alt clicking, Control X, trying to keep our geometry as simple as possible. Also making it easier for us to select our column mesh islands versus our window mesh islands. Speaking of the windows, I'm going to Control R cut another edge vertically in each window segment. And now let's select the faces that will become our windows. I will hit Y to separate them but keep them part of the mesh, and then I to inset. Although before I inset, I'm going to tab back to object mode because I think I never applied the scale. Control A and apply the scale. Also, while I'm thinking about it, we're in flat shading view, I think. Let's go to Studio to see a little more of our 3D shapes that make sense. Tab into edit mode, and let's try that inset again so we get a nice even inset. Very, very subtle. I'm not going very far, but also in our options, I want to enable individual. And then once they're individualized, Alt S to push them out, and these will become our windows. And right away you can see the core shape structure of our building, and hopefully you can see what I mean by that layered depth. We have the column, which is one layer, we've got the windows, and then we've got the space in between windows, all at different depths, all making a more interesting shape to look at. Not too simple, not too complex, just right. Now, when it comes to windows on a skyscraper, I'm a little bit OCD about this, but same thing we did with these sidewalk panels. I never want them to be exactly even, because if we switch to a matcap view, that might not be the best. What if we just go to our material preview and go ahead and add a reflective material like our Cubicity glass. And then I'll also add Vertex Paint really quick, which floods it with white by default. So now you can see the reflection of our HDRI in the windows, and it's perfectly flat, too perfect. There's absolutely no breakup in the window position, and that's just not believable. So let's tab into edit mode. In face select, we will go one by one and select each window main panel and just slightly rotate it. Same as we did for the sidewalk. Oh, I'm just realizing I never turned on screencast keys. I'm really sorry. At this point, we've been using the exact same tools, so hopefully you don't need the screencast keys if you're as familiar with the tools as I expect you are, but still, I'm sorry I forgot that. All right, so yes, I'm rotating and holding shift just to slightly alter the direction of their face. All right, even as I do that little move, look at how the reflection changes over here on the other side. You see that? That's what I'm going for. Subtle, subtle shifts, but pretty big difference, especially when you see it in the full context. So I'm just going to go quickly and randomly rotate. I think the biggest bang for your buck is rotating in the Z-axis. But I also want to be sure not to go too far to where the window is inset inward. That is too far. And if I get close to that, you know, maybe just GY moving it out. All right, but you get the idea by this point. So let me just do it quickly. All right, let's zoom out. And now you can see how our reflection is much more broken up. That is so much better. However, it is still repeated. So I want to show you how we can alter our array modifier to help with this vertical repetition. Horizontally, it's more random, but vertically, it's the exact same pattern. So if we go to object mode, and if we look at our modifier settings for the array, we have relative offset by default, but we also have object offset. And if we enable that, it will let us pick an object that will influence the transformation of our array data. So I'm going to keep my cursor here the same position as the object and hit Shift A, and we're going to add an empty plain axes. I'm going to rename this to array rotation. All right, now in the array modifier, let's choose that object, array rotation, select that object, and watch what happens when we rotate in Z. Kind of get the idea what we're doing here, because if we RZ 90 and then look at our reflection pattern, it's not as easily noticed that it's a repetition. So just to confirm this, let's undo the rotation. I'm going to tab into edit mode and quickly assign some colors. All right, so clearly you can see the repetition vertically, but whenever we rotate our array rotation 90 degrees, 90, now it's offset just enough. We still have the mirroring, but this is random enough for me, and it's going to achieve that very specific skyscraper type reflective look. I admit that I put a lot of emphasis in randomizing things like windows and the sidewalk panels, but anyway, I will get rid of those temporary colors in Vertex Paint. We'll just paint it, white, I guess, for now. We're not done with the model, though. That is the bulk of the model using the array modifier, but I want to add another layer of depth. We'll go back to solid viewport shading, and just out of curiosity, you can still see how the reflections are broken up using this matte cap, so that's good. But we're going to go to our studio mode, and I am going to add a secondary separator between the floors every other floor, let's say. So I can achieve this if I tab into edit mode. Let's select this first floor cube, essentially Shift D, right click. Let's just separate by selection with P. And then I'm gonna, in edit mode, scale this way down vertically and then snap it so it's at the bottom of our first floor. All right, now we're gonna scale by median point, which we already were doing. S, Shift Z, we're gonna scale it out like this. Let's fill it in. Since it's a simple cube, we just have open faces, easily fillable with F. All right, let's make sure that we place this where we want it, probably in between like that. So it's kind of covering up some of that bottom row. You see that? Now let's add an array modifier. Same thing up in Z. Although it's not going to be one unit, we're going to have to dial this in. So I'm going to go up every other floor. Just make sure it fits. Maybe I need to be a little skinnier. There we go. And then we'll add however many counts we can get in. There we go, before the ceiling. So 5 count makes sense. It was 10, I believe, divided by 2. So this is another level of layered depth that just, gives the building a little more interest to the eye. All right, so let's address the roof quickly. Shift D, I'm going to duplicate the layers we just created, snap it to the top. Well, let's move it past the top and then snap it to the top. And get rid of the array modifier. It's just going to be the 1. We'll give it a little extra thickness in edit mode. Just bring up that top face. I to inset. E to extrude down. Most buildings have this kind of, fenced off border. It's not a fence, but people can walk up to the edge and not fall over. And then I also want to give it a couple layers on top. So Control R, I'm going to make this symmetrical, cut in the middle, and right click to avoid any sliding. Let's add a mirror modifier, turn off X, enable Y. And then I'm just going to select the top face, Shift D, right click SX, SY, make it pretty skinny in the Y axis, move it closer to the border, maybe not quite that skinny in Y. E, let's extrude up. And then I'm going to select each of the 4 corner edges with Shift, Control, Alt, and click. You have to do that twice if you've got one selected already. A twice to deselect, Shift, Control, Alt, click. All right, that's got all of our corners. Control B, let's give them a little bevel. Select the top face, do that same thing of insetting, E, extruding down a little bit. And then let's select that top face one more time, one more layer, Shift D, right click, SX. I'm going to scale it so it's less than that first level that we extruded. SY, let's enable clipping and kind of crush that into the center. I want to make sure that this, when I extrude it, is going to be overlapping our other level. I to inset, E to extrude down, and we need to fix the center here. I'm just going to delete these 2 faces. Alt click to select the border edge, and we can crush that into the horizon of symmetry in the Y axis. All right, there we go. Very interesting levels up top. And let's take our human ref. Where did that guy go? Let's snap him to the top. Let's see if this is enough space for a human to stand. Okay, it looks like it's not quite. So let's select both of these levels that we extruded, SZ. Well, first let's select a vertex that we can use as the active element, SZ. Just make that a little bit taller. All right, now it makes sense that this could be, you know, a section of the building with a door that they walk out of. All right, so that's going to be it for the roof. This is a great canvas to populate with some of our HVAC units, maybe a skylight, antennas, all kinds of things. But the only thing left to address is going to be the front door. So I want to move my human ref back down. Let's just, maybe I don't have them selected. Let's select our human ref, Alt G, and then move it in Y. Let's see, this way. I believe this is the front. If I don't know, I can enable that widget up here in the corner. So yeah, this is the front of the 3D scene. And our front door is going to go right here. Let's select our first floor object. We can remove the upper section. It was essentially just serving as a placeholder for the height. Let's delete the vertices. And let's think about how we can make a front door out of this. Let's see. I think I will lean on symmetry again. All right, so let's cut an edge down the middle, front to back, and delete one side. And I'm not going to mirror the front to the back because, you know, the front's going to have like a grand entrance that looks good with curb appeal. The back, you know, faces the alley and it's underwhelming generally, or maybe even completely neglected in terms of design. I just leave it blank. But the front is very important. So let's add a mirror modifier just in the X axis. I'm going to cut another edge, maybe slide it a little bit towards the center, and then 3, let's select this face, E to extrude inward. Let's remove that central face. Maybe move this edge in to give it a bit of an angle. So now our front doors would sit right in here, and we need some stairs that lead up to the front door. All right, so let's remove these 2 faces. Maybe remove everything on the bottom. We don't really need the bottom face of our building. All right, E to extrude this down. Let's scale to 0 using the 3D cursor. And for stairs, I'm going to select this face, Shift D to duplicate, E, Y to move it out. So that's going to be kind of the depth of our stairs, and then GX, that's going to be the width of our stairs. Yeah, so we've got this kind of layering effect. You're going to hear that a lot as I build buildings. I don't want to be a broken record, but it is a guiding principle for me. All right, so let's Control L, P to separate this by the selection, and then select our stair object and object set origin to the geometry. Okay, so we were using the mirror modifier. Let's undo that change of the origin placement. Let's apply the mirror modifier and then object set origin to geometry. I want it right there in the center. Make sure there's no face here in the middle, which there is. Okay. We don't really need that edge in the center. Control X. All right, let's tab into object mode, select our stair object and the human ref, and then Shift H to hide everything else. Go to the 3 side orthographic, and I just want to find a decent stair height. Control R to cut edges to be the height of each stair. Just going to eyeball this. That's 6, and then Control R, let's do 6 high as well. All right, so these are going to be shallower stairs than they are tall. You know, this can be preference. It's up to the style of the building, whatever you're feeling. And then go to face select mode, Z wireframe, and select all the faces that can be deleted, leaving me with a staircase. All right. And then in a perspective view, we can easily use F2 to just fill all of our stair treads and rises. And now to simplify the geometry, because it's way too much for the side of our stairs here, to easily simplify this, I'm going to select, let's see, in side orthographic, C circle select all of our remaining verts that aren't part of that stair step shape on both sides, and then select this corner as the active element, and then scale Shift X so it doesn't scale in X, and then 0. All right, that brings all of our verts down, leaving us with quads here in the corner, M to merge by distance, and that removes 54 verts for a very simple staircase. All right, let's tab to object mode, Alt H to bring everything else back. And I do like how it's kind of extending beyond our angled walls here. It just more of that layered depth principle. And really, we just need to outline some windows and we'll be done. So on the first floor, let's cut one edge up top and then one on the side. These will become windows or glass. Let's hit E, right click, and then Alt S. We'll push them in using offset even. Let's delete this central face. Maybe bring this up so it's not, you know, perfectly flat next to the stair. Yeah, like that. All right, then I am going to separate these faces, or just using Y, so split rather than separate technically. And this will allow me to cut an edge cleanly on these window faces without cutting to the other top and bottom portion. Let's cut one in the middle to represent our doors. All right, now let's do the same thing up top as we did up top by insetting on individual basis. Whoops, I didn't apply the scale here. Control A, apply scale in object mode. I to inset just slightly on an individual basis, Alt S to push them out, and then rotate them a little bit randomly. You know the drill. Okay, and then that is going to be a finished skyscraper model. Oh. Except I left this huge gap at the top for some reason. There we go. Now it's a finished model. Next, let's add some materials to our skyscraper by jumping into the shading workspace. And let's see, we can hide our reference collection. Speaking of collections, our buildings collection is not organized at all, so we might as well name our objects and organize that properly. Let's start by creating a new collection. Let's call it Skyscraper A, assuming there will be other letters, and CG Cookie. We'll throw all of these objects into that collection, and let's rename these. I should probably start everything with the prefix of Skyscraper A. So Skyscraper A array rotation, and then Skyscraper A floor 1, Skyscraper A floors, Skyscraper A separators, roof, and stairs. Okay, and next I'm going to add material slots for all of our objects before I begin adding vertex colors. So starting at the base floor, let's add concrete and also a window material. Let's add concrete to the stairs. And then concrete to the separators. Let's see, the floors already have the glass, but it needs a concrete. And let's assign that to the proper mesh islands. Let's see, if I start selecting the window mesh islands, Control I to invert, that gives me all my concrete, assign, and then up to the top for the roof, it needs concrete, and maybe that's it. All right, so now that I've got my materials assigned, when I add vertex colors, it will nicely finalize each piece. At the bottom, jump into vertex paint, tab into edit mode, select the windows, and then back to vertex paint. Now I want to create a color palette to have our most important colors readily accessible now and if we need to edit them in the future. So in our active tool and workspace settings, you can find color palette. I'm going to create new, and let's Control V to call it Skyscraper A. And I'm going to paint our windows like a rich blue. You can really do any color. Being a stylized theme, I am going to take advantage of multiple colors for windows and concrete, stuff like that. But I know my tendency can be leaning towards realism, which would mean kind of putting the window closer to desaturated or white. But I want to give it more saturation in the blue direction, also a little bit darker. Enable selection masking, Shift K, and that doesn't look like it's reflecting. Maybe because I haven't assigned it yet. There we go. Control I to invert our selection, vertex paint, and then hit X. Actually, before I hit X, let's hit the plus button in the color palette so it saves our glass blue, and then X to switch our color swatch and choose a gray, kind of a mid-gray. But again, for concrete, it doesn't always have to be a desaturated gray. So I recommend to at least try injecting some color. So since we were in the blue direction, I'm going to go the opposite, slightly warm gray for the concrete. Shift K. Let's jump to object mode. Yeah, I think that's a pretty decent value. And then for our stairs, let's choose a slightly different gray. Back to vertex paint. And let's add this original gray concrete color and then darken it slightly and add that one. So we've got all the colors stored in our color palette, and then Shift K. A nice subtle difference in tone between our concretes. And then let's move on up to our separators, vertex paint. I think I'm going to paint these a dark gray as well. Whoops, I went to weight paint by accident. Vertex paint, Shift K, next object. For our floors, vertex paint. Let's see what I have selected, our concrete. All right, so let's hit Shift K for our dark concrete first, and then tab back into edit mode, deselect our columns with Shift L, and we'll paint the rest of our concrete the lighter color. And then tab into edit mode, select our window islands, and paint those blue. And then all we have left is our roof. Tab into edit mode. Let's just paint the whole thing. Let's see, the darker gray. Yeah. Actually, the darker gray I'm going to leave for the upward facing surface of the roof. So let's actually swap these, paint everything the lighter gray, tab into edit mode, and just select the up-facing faces, and X first to swap our color swatches, Shift K. Okay. All right, I think that looks pretty good. Sometimes roofs are like a type of asphalt, or at least in texture, so we could try what that looks like in slot 2. Select our asphalt and assign that. I'm also going to turn off my light and go dark so I can concentrate on the color specifically. Yeah, I think I like just regular concrete actually. So if we remove the slot for our asphalt, it'll go back to concrete. All right, so that is our colors and materials applied. Now, you may notice that the gradient isn't quite doing what we want for the windows in the array modified floor sections. it's only concentrated in the first level. So if we select that, and we can visualize why if we enable in our object properties in viewport display texture space. All right, you can see now. Can you see that? Okay, maybe it's easier. You see this little black wireframe? That is our texture space. And usually for every object, it gives that texture space to the dimensions. If we go back to our material preview, you can see that our stairs have a great gradient from the bottom to the top of only the stairs by itself. Then our first floor has a gradient from the bottom to the top of it. That's generally how it works, same for the roof. However, since we're using an array modifier, our texture space doesn't take into account the dimensions after the array. But we can modify this in our object data under texture space. And if we disable auto texture space, we can adjust the size in Z. Whoops, we're not on the right object. Let's go back to our floors. Okay, so let me go back, re-enable auto texture space for our first floor, go back to our array modifier object, disable auto texture space, and scale up in Z. And I just want to make this texture space cube match the dimensions by moving it up and scaling it up just to get close. Doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. Now, if we shift control click on the soft light, that's the concrete. Let's go to our Cubicity glass, shift control click on the soft light. You can see that our gradient goes from the bottom all the way up to the top of our floors. And that is much better, much more appealing. Let's see what this looks like from other lighting HDRIs. Yeah, I think this is going to work out really well. What about the night scene? Ooh, yeah, that looks good. Of course, I'll have to figure out a system for only turning on like certain lights if we do the nighttime scene. I'll have to think about that. But first priority is a daytime scene, and it's looking pretty good. However, the more I look at these objects, there's another trick I want to introduce to our materials, which we'll do in the next video. So far, we've established one sort of stylistic rule for all of our materials, and that is the gradient from bottom to top on virtually every object we've created. Now I want to implement a second rule of the Cubicity universe, and that is edge highlighting, which will essentially draw lighter values into the edges of our geometry. And this should serve to kind of soften our harsh geometric edges, while also giving a little more variety to the hues and tones globally across all of our objects. And we can implement this with an ambient occlusion node. So first I want to make sure that I have a concrete material active in our shader node editor, and we'll add an input ambient occlusion. So if we shift control click on this, let's focus on the roof since it's all a concrete material. What ambient occlusion does is emphasize contact shadows, where two pieces of geometry come close together in a corner, and in that corner it darkens. However, we're not interested in the darkening as much as we're interested in the edges, and we have this ability to flip the normals of the ambient occlusion calculation, which essentially draws darkness into our edges. And you can see how that works here in the viewport. Now I am going to enable only local because that means it will only calculate the object itself. It will not calculate from any other objects to this one. And so, we don't want the edges to be dark. We actually want this color inverted. So let's add a converter color ramp and simply flip our color flags and then change the interpolation to B-spline. And let's drag up the black flag. And you can see how this works. We get a wonderful variety of gradient focused on the edges in white and falling off to dark. And when we add this into our node network as a mix overlay, shift control click on the overlay by itself and then turn it on and off. Hopefully you see where I'm going with this. I think that's a huge jump in appeal for very little effort. And again, it's global because it's using the ambient occlusion render setting. And now when we see that plugged into our principled BSDF, the effect is going to be fairly subtle. Let's turn off our overlays. But then when we mute our overlay node, yeah, that's exactly what I'm after. Kind of another level of gradient type in our materials, which is great because we're only applying a solid color as a base and we're layering these gradient effects on top. However, there is a problem when it comes to our small objects like the stairs down here. So if we Shift-Control-Click on the color ramp of the ambient occlusion, it's pretty much all white. Because the scale is so much smaller, the distance value of our ambient occlusion is too great for this size of an object, but it works great for a large building like this. So I'm going to actually create a node group with 3 different levels of ambient occlusion, which is a new technique to this course, and it's kind of an advanced technique, but follow along and I think you'll understand the benefits once we get to the end. But we're going to start by creating our 3 different levels of ambient occlusion. So the first one, let's adjust the distance to like 0.5 in half. Okay, yeah, let's stick with that for the first one. Shift D to duplicate another set, and we're going to go down to like 0.1, Shift-Control-Click. All right, so this is actually maybe a little too small. How about 0.2? Yeah, this will be a good mid-level. And then we're going to do one more. Let's move these up, duplicate the last one, and we're going to focus on the stairs for our last level. Now, you may notice real quick that the stairs actually look pretty good up top, but the ambient occlusion adjusts around the borders of our viewport, and this is because of screen space ambient occlusion, which is how Eevee operates. All of its fancy render techniques are screen space. But this doesn't usually happen whenever there's other objects surrounding it. So if we enable the reference collection, which has our ground city template, it goes away, but it can be annoying to look at by itself. Now I want to bring back an object that also has the concrete material in standalone. Let's see, we'll turn off everything except the tree. And I need to move these objects out. Where are these objects? There it is. Okay, so let's look at this, because this is maybe the smallest scale we're going to deal with, and it shows why we need a 3rd level even smaller in terms of distance. All right, so let's make sure we're on the concrete material, and let's change the distance to 0.04. Shift-Control-Click on that. Okay, now we're extremely focused on just the edges, which is needed for our smallest objects like the tree here, also the cars. And so with these 3 levels, we should be able to address any scale object. And you can see that the tight edges on the building aren't that consequential. Also, the further we get from the object, the thinner lines disappear. Also a reason why we need 3 different levels. Now, how can we mix these 3 ambient occlusions together? Let's use a color mix RGB node, and we'll take the first one into color 2, and we're going to change the mix type to be add. All right, this will essentially ignore the darker values and add the lighter values to whatever color is in color 1. So we'll start with a black for visualization, but this color swatch will be important to dial in this effect later. And then we will duplicate this for another add, take the second ambient occlusion factor, duplicate again, and the third. All right, Shift-Control-Click on the last add, and we can see all these effects together, where we can have individual control over the factors. We can turn the first one all the way up or down, the middle one up or down, same for the third one. Now, we can turn this collection of nodes into a node group. So let's do that quickly, and I'll tell you why it's so powerful. So all of these ambient occlusion relevant nodes, let's select them and Control G. Now they are inside a node group. It's kind of like tabbing into edit mode on a mesh. All right, so we are inside the node group, and if we tab, this is the actual node. And it's really nice that we can drag out certain parameters to be edited in the group. So let's tab back in. For example, our factors for our mixes. Let's go back to 0.5 as a default value for all of them. And then we'll drag that factor over here to the group input. Whoops, didn't get that last one. And then we can rename these. If we hit the N key to bring up our view properties panel, let's see, under the group option, we can name our factors. Let's say AO1, AO2, AO3. Pretty simple. And then for the outputs, we don't need the second one. I'm not sure where that came from. Oh, it must be the viewer node. We'll just take the last add and plug it into the color output. Okay, tab back to our regular shader node view. All right, so shift control click on that. Same control, we can turn down the first one, second one, turn up the last one, whatever we want. So this is great. Let's shift control click on the concrete for our building. Let's see how everything looks. Let's see, let's crank up the overlay all the way. Okay, that's right. So this is where it becomes important for that one color swatch. Remember, we left it at black so we could see the maximum difference, but with the overlay blend mode, black will darken everything, but a value of 0.5 will have no effect. And that's essentially what we want. We only want to draw lighter values to the edges. So if we tab into the node group, we should also give it a name before we tab in. Let's call it Cubicity Edge Highlight. Select that and copy it, paste it to the label, also paste it to the properties node group. And also, yeah, I forgot that edge highlighting is the whole purpose. So maybe it would make more sense if I renamed from AO to just call it Edge 1, Edge 2. Okay. Now back to this color swatch. We need to change that to 0.5. Tab back out, and now our overlay, if we turn that on and off, shift control click on it, and when we mute it, we're only adding light values to our existing color. All right, now let's see what that looks like in the Principled BSDF. Looks pretty good. The concrete's maybe a little bit lighter now than I would want it, but maybe not. I'll leave it for now. However, there is a problem. Remember, smaller objects don't really need that first value at all. If we turn edge 1 all the way down and then turn maybe edge 3 all the way up, this is what we want for smaller scale objects. Although now that I'm turning that on and off, maybe our color value of 0.5 is a little too high. Since we're only introducing the light values, in a broad sense, the whole color seems to get lighter. Probably why I thought the concrete on the building is a little light now. But if we change that to 0.4, everything will get a little bit darker where it's not an edge. And this might help balance out the color. Let's try muting that on and off. Yeah, so it's like we start with the color in the middle, and then the edge highlighting takes it over here, and the dark brings it back down. So it ends up being a little more balanced. But let's get back to essentially what I want to try and implement is a condition. If an object is small scale, then we basically ignore edge 1. And if it's a large scale, we include edge 1. And we can actually set this up with a vertex group. So if we select our tree object, jump into color attributes, I'm going to hit the plus button, and we're going to create a color attribute called isSmall. All right, it's going to be face corner byte color, and then the color is going to be white. Now think through this with me. By default, our material, whenever we add it and there is no vertex colors, it goes to black. So we can use that to our advantage and only add a color attribute called isSmall when it's a white color. All right, so now if we tab into our edge highlight node group, Shift A, let's add input attributes isSmall, and Shift Control click on it. Now you can see that our tree trunk, though it's sharing the same material as the building is black, tree trunk is white, building is big, tree trunk is small. So we can use that to turn off this first addition. Now mathematically, I want to take the color ramp and multiply it by 0, by black, so that it adds nothing to this base color. That means I need to invert. Let's go to color, invert our attribute. All right, now the building is white, tree trunk is black, and I can multiply that black value over top of our color ramp, our first color ramp. So let's go to converter math. Let's multiply here by this inverted vertex color. All right, so let's see how that plays out practically. Tab back to object mode, and I keep making a mess because it automatically adds a viewer node if I'm viewing it. You know, it makes sense that it would do that, but I don't want the viewer in the end. Okay, there, that's cleaner. All right, so let's turn edge highlighting all the way back up. Let's see, how can I easily visualize this? I might need to temporarily turn this value back down. Our 0.4, let's go back down to 0 for black so that we can see this. All right, as I pull the edge one up, our building gets that first edge highlighting, but our tree does not. Now it almost makes me wonder, do I need the edge 2 at all? Maybe not. Often my brain works in a rule of threes, but perhaps in this case we don't need it. Well, I'll leave it for now, but possibly we'll delete the edge 2. Let's just leave it off, and then if I find myself needing it, then I'll keep it, but if not, then I'll just delete it. Now for this condition, any small object, I just have to add that color attribute called isSmall at a default fully white for it to take effect in the shader. So for our stairs, let's add another isSmall, and all our other settings should be kept. And there we go. It only keeps the second and third edge highlighting. So that is actually pretty cool. By using vertex colors, I don't have to create like a big concrete material and then a small concrete material. This is all pretty nicely contained and efficient for implementing across all of our objects. And at this point, since we've got the node group implemented, let's finish setting it up for concrete specifically. Just make sure it's exactly what we want. I need to go back and change the color swatch to a 0.4. And then one more time, let's just turn it off and on the overlay. You see that little subtle edge highlighting actually does a lot. Okay, so let's implement that into other materials like the tree leaves here. We can simply select and Control-C to copy this node group, jump over to our Cubicity tree leaves, Control-V, or you can also Shift-A and under Group, select Cubicity Edge Highlight. But I think copying and pasting is a little more intuitive. It also keeps our values that we set up. But notice this too. So all of our internal node group is being shared anywhere that we paste this. And so again, that concept of linking and sharing data where possible is very powerful. Now, I also probably should have copied the overlay node, and then we put that here, since it's going to be, blended the same type of way. All right, now we've got edge highlighting on our leaves. We can dial this into taste if we want. All right, changing these outer settings is not affecting the settings on our concrete. However, if we tab into our node group and change any of these settings, that will be propagated to every other instance of this node group. So that's something important to keep in mind as well. All right, where was I? I think I was seeing what this looked like on the leaves on and off. Oh, it's a small object, so we need to add the vertex color group. Is small, and it would probably be smart to just copy this for quick creation of the node group elsewhere. All right, so now that first one has no effect. Very subtle, but that edge highlighting serves to soften those harsh cube edges. Now we still have several objects left to go. So let's turn off our building and try and focus on objects so that we cover all our materials for the sake of the video. I don't want to go through each one of our objects again, but if we just cover the materials, like our roof access, which has a brick material, which we have not implemented the edge highlighting into. However, the roof is concrete and it does implement the material, but it needs that small vertex color attribute. Is small, okay, and there we go. Now for the brick material, let's go ahead and add the is small group, and then jump over to our concrete material, copy the edge highlight as well as the overlay, Control C, Control V. Let's see that on and off. Okay, so that doesn't have a huge effect, does it? Let's see. Okay, what it might be doing is whenever I change the interpolation to B-spline, you know, it kind of takes our white flag and spreads it out. So even the top of the spectrum here is less than 1. So if I pull back the white, I mean, I shouldn't have to go that far, but that should help see more of the edge highlighting. Let's just shift control click on the overlay itself. Okay, so that's getting better. Oh yeah, I think I just brought down the black flag a little too much. That does look a lot better. Oh yeah, here the second level actually does help a lot. Okay, that looks great. All right, let's make sure it still looks good on our tree, because everything sharing data will affect everything else. Okay, I still think the edge highlighting looks good on the tree. All right, so being aware of the global effect of this edge highlighting. All right, so that's good for our brick material. Now, how about our metal material? Let's bring a traffic light into the mix. All right, so our metal does not have this edge highlighting involved, so let's select the nodes, Control C, and paste them over here. Now, metal, I will actually do something unique. But first, let's just start with the typical color. It needs the color attribute is small. Now remember, it's very important that this is typed exactly the same because our node network is looking for that specific string. So if you mess it up, it won't function. All right, so now it's just concentrating on edge 2 and 1. I think I'm gonna only do 1. All right, so let's see what that looks like plugged in to our base color. All right, so we can see a little bit of an effect, edge highlighting off and on. But when it comes to metal, often on the edges, the reflective qualities will be a little more dull or in some cases a little shinier. Simply using the edge highlighting to adjust our roughness has a pretty big impact. So we're going to take the edge highlighting color information. I'm going to add a reroute, drag it down, and then add a converter color ramp. And we're going to modify the edge highlighting to get back to black and white for the sake of adjusting our roughness. All right, so let's shift control click on that, change it to B-spline, and then drag up our black flag. Then I want to add this value. In other words, add the light values on our edges to the roughness of 0.5. We can do that with a color mix node, where the top color is our 0.5 value, and then when we add our lighter values, we're getting a duller effect just on the edges. So let's plug that into roughness and see what that looks like. And it might be difficult to tell. I'm not sure if I can I mute this? Yeah, I can mute the whole thing. It's going to be hard to tell exactly what that's doing. This is also penetrating. Maybe if I make our color more extreme so that it's like a mirror finish on top. Let's take the color swatch 1 all the way down. Now you can see that as we approach the edge, our reflections get more dull, especially if you crank that all the way up. You see that? All right, edges are getting much more dull. We don't need it to be that extreme. Let's go to like 0.6 addition, maybe 0.5. And we don't want the top one to be so low. We do want that to be, how about 0.4? There we go. but you know that it is working, and that subtle little touch to tweak the reflections goes a long way. In fact, we'll do the same thing to the plastic material, or no, it's called painted material. All right, so let's copy all of these nodes. Control C, paste them into our Cubicity painted material. Whoops. We'll move these out of the way. Forgot to bring over the reroutes, didn't I? All right, that's plugged up properly, but we do not have an is small vertex color attribute. There we go. All right, now it's a pretty automated process. Any object that we want to add edge highlighting to, or if we want the edge highlighting to blur our reflections on the edges, that's very easily copied and pasted. And let's see what it looks like on our vehicles, for example. All right, that's the bus. What about our pickup truck? Oh, right. I always need to remember that if it's a small object, it needs that vertex group. Yeah, that looks great. I love how it softens the edges and almost gives it a painterly quality to the texture or to the color. It's not really much of a texture, but the appearance of it being, yeah, softened. I just think it looks really good. All right, so all that's left to do now is make sure that all my materials have it that need it. What about our glass material? I think that's the last one, asphalt as well. What does our street section look like? Did that get much benefit from edge highlighting? I think it might need to be small. Okay, it's definitely being affected, but that's only on the edges. You know, that error where we don't have any objects near it, but I don't really see much on the concrete itself. Let's turn the overlay on and off. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be doing too much. That's fine. I mean, I guess it wouldn't really make sense. You know, there aren't a ton of these harsh 90-degree angles, so that's fine. I don't really think our streets needed it that much. But let's go back to where we started with our building and see about the glass. That's the last material we need to address. So we'll turn off standalone and ground, bring back our building, which looks great with the concrete. Now for the windows, let's see, we'll copy these nodes just in case and then jump over to slot. Let's see. Okay, Cubicity glass, Control V to paste those, and then we'll tie them in. Let the shader recompile. Let's turn on and off. Let's just see what the overlay looks like by itself. Okay, not much. How about we take the edge 2 up? There we go. All right, let's see what that looks like incorporated. Yeah. Again, all of this is pretty subtle, but hopefully you can tell if we turn it on and off. Our windows kind of get a softened effect. That's really the only word I can use for it. Like a little bit of depth to the glass, as if there's thickness or something. Anyway, aesthetically, I'm a big fan of that. So edge highlighting, definitely something I'm happy is part of the style equation now. Next, I want to create a corner building that's going to be a retail space on the first floor and the upper floor's residential apartments. And this will fit right in the corner of our intersection. So let's hop over to Unsplash and get an idea for the style of building I'm aiming for. This first photo is going to be my main reference because I really like the first floor, how it's got large windows with an arch over top. I think that's a very quaint retail space. And then the upper floors are more traditional brownstone, very cubish, with the windowsills up top and bottom. Or at least I know it's a windowsill on the bottom. I don't know what it's called on the top. But those mid-frequency details should, you know, help to spice up the layered depth thing I keep talking about. And so again, this is my main reference. However, there's one significant structure change I want to make. It's very common to see on corner buildings the corner edge beveled so that we have a 45-degree entry through a door and room for a couple windows. I think this makes a corner building just a little more dynamic and interesting to look at. And so here's a couple other images showcasing this beveled corner. but again, in the style of this building here. So let's jump back to Blender, and I'm going to create a new collection in our buildings collection, and we will call this residential-corner-a underscore CG cookie. So if I make another residential corner building, it can be corner B or C, and so on. And then let's hide our other building. Let's bring back our reference collection and hop over to the modeling workspace, tab into object mode. Let's see, I must be in local view. Yeah, you can see up here in the left corner. So let's hit the / key to leave local view. Now, we know that our template has vertex colors, but they're showing up as black, and that's just a temporary glitch where if you tab into edit mode and then tab back out to object mode, it fixes it. And let's go back to our new collection, residential corner A, and Shift C makes sure that our cursor is in the center of the world, which it is. Shift A, let's add mesh cube. All right, these 2x2 dimensions are going to be great, at least in X and Y. We'll probably go higher than that in Z. But tab into edit mode immediately and set the cube on the ground plane by hitting G, Z, and 1. By now you should know the standard procedure. I always want the object origin on the ground along with the bottom of our objects. And so from here I can hit G, Shift Z to scoot it along the ground, and Control, hold that to snap it into the corner there. And I'm also going to take my human ref and put that over in the corner too. Now, the first thing I recommend doing is implementing the corner bevel. So tab into edit mode, select that corner edge, Control B. Wait a minute, I don't have screencast keys refreshed. There we go. So with that corner selected, Control B, and what I'm looking for is to make our bevel just wide enough to support a door with a little bit of margin. All right, so let's just say 0.35 meters in our width parameter of the bevel operator. That should be enough for a good sized door, and a little bit of margin on each side, obviously enough for windows going vertically. Now I want to show you an example where modeling a corner building like this can be very cumbersome. And so to show this, I'm going to pretend like I'm cutting in a window here on the corner. All right, so we'll extrude this inward. And now let's say I wanted to create a windowsill for this. I would just duplicate a plane. Let's scale it down. Let's use our medium point, scale in Z, maybe scale it up a little bit. Now I want to push it outward to give it some depth. But the problem is I don't have a specific axis to do that. So if I hit GY, we're moving in a 45-degree angle. GX, we're moving in a 45-degree angle. Those are the global coordinates. If I hit GYY for local axes, they are by default aligned to global, so it's the same problem. However, I can disjoint the global from local and make it work for us to where our local axes will be aligned to this 45-degree bevel, and our global axes will stay as usual, which is ideal for modeling on the sides of our building. Now, if you're wondering, well, you could just hit Alt-S to push it out. That is true for this particular situation, but there's a lot of modeling techniques that lean on the axes. And so I want to show you how to set this up. Let's undo until we get back to just that flat corner bevel. And let's tab to object mode, Shift S, cursor to selected. Make sure that our cursor is at the object origin of our object. And I'm going to be rotating according to that 3D cursor. I just want to make sure I'm doing the same thing in edit mode as object mode. And so in object mode, let's hit RZ -45. And then immediately tab into edit mode, select everything and hit RZ. Again, we're rotating around the pivot point, and +45. Now, if I go back to object mode and enable our gizmos, and let's say the move gizmo, you can see that our local space is aligned to this 45-degree corner. But if I switch to global space, it's aligned to the sides of our building. And this way, if I needed to move this face out, I'm not dependent on Alt-S. I can hit GYY. And now we're moving perpendicular to that face. And so in my experience, this is a very critical setup whenever I'm modeling a corner building like this. It's also helpful whenever we implement a mirror modifier soon. But with that established, let's start, structuring our building floor by floor. We'll start with the ground floor. So Control R, I'm going to cut an edge just a little bit off the ground. Remember, with a skyscraper, we kind of raise the bottom floor off the ground so stairs can lead up. It's the same idea here. So this becomes the actual ground. We'll snap our character there. And then I'm going to cut another edge for the first floor ceiling, which will be pretty high, maybe about 3 humans tall, something like that. And then for our residential floors, let's move that to be kind of normal height, maybe half a person taller than our person. I think that'll work out good. I'm going to separate this top floor, select these faces, and P, separate by selection. Now we've got our first floor, which we can begin modeling like the photo we saw. How about we select our human ref, and all our objects so far go into local view. And then on our ground floor, let's delete the bottom face, and let's set up a mirror modifier. Might as well. Control R, I'm going to cut right in the center of our 45-degree bevel, delete everything on the other side. So we're going to be mirroring exactly the same, except everything's turned 45 degrees. And since our local space allows for this, we can add a mirror modifier and get the other half in the x-axis, the local x-axis, for free. It should be said that the mirror modifier operates by default on local axes. And so now we can focus on just this half. Let's see, I'm going to cut 2 edges and scale them in X using the median point, SX. And these will become just kind of slight pillar extrusions. All right, so just select those and push them out with E ever so slightly. And then I'm going to cut an edge horizontally, which will be the top of our arch. I'm going to cut 2 more edges, scale in X. And now we've made room, which will become our large window. But to create our arch, Control R, I'm going to cut another edge down the middle and move this point up. I actually don't like the gizmos. I just like remembering the axis hotkeys. So GZ, let's move that up. And now let's select our faces. That will become our windows, and E to extrude in. Now to make the arch, let's select that top edge at the peak and Control B. But we need to look in our operator options and increase the segments significantly, like 6. And then adjust the width, holding Shift to make those incremental changes pretty small. And that looks pretty even, but I don't love the shallowness of the arch. So I'm going to select those faces and then switch to vertex selection. Select one on the corner, make that our active element pivot, and I can SZ to scale it up to give it more of an extreme arch. And then let's see, let's get rid of that vertex. Oh, there was more than one vertex there. Let's just fill this first. And that's fine, it's one big n-gon. But if I want, I can make triangles using the J hotkey. Select my verts, J, and then join in the center. Let's then get rid of our center vert here. We can simply select that border edge with Alt-clicking and then fill it, because by filling it, I can hit I to inset a nice even frame to become a window frame. Let's see, Control P, let's just Y split this to disassociate what will be the window frame and the window from the wall structure. I'll do the same with the window itself. Select it, hit Y, and then L to select what will become the window frame. Let's move that in Y a little bit. E to extrude back. I'll also enable face orientation so I can keep track of my normals. Anything that's red, I need to select and hit Shift in. Maybe make the window a little deeper, move it back in Y. Okay, now let's create some cross sections for our window frame. Control R, let's cut an edge on both sides, select them both, Shift Alt clicking, SZ. We'll scale in our median point so they're both flat. Then we'll move that up, Control B to bevel about like this. It's going to be a wider bevel than the rest of our frame. And we'll take the segments down to 1 and then delete actually delete both faces, and we will bridge in between. Select both of the open border edges, loop, bridge. Now we need some vertical sections. Actually, I probably made my life harder by adding thickness to the window frame so soon. So let's fix that. Let's see, select everything, Shift L, Shift H, and I want to cut an edge around the border of each side. And then when I delete those verts, it'll leave me, you know, the thickness separated. And now I'm back to a flat plane, Alt H to bring everything back. Okay. So yeah, I should have cut my cross sections horizontally and vertically before extruding. Control R, let's think how many sections we want vertically. Let's go with 3, maybe 3 down below and then 2 up top. All right, let's do the below first. Let's just make sure that we have aligned edges. Select them both and then SX, so they're straight. And then select all 6, Control B, so they're beveled the same. This is defining the thickness. We can fill those. And then up top, how about we just cut one in the middle of each side, and it will connect to the corresponding vertex. But I need to bevel this. Just the vert itself, which if we hit Control B and bevel, nothing happens. But if we switch to vertices, we'll see that we can bevel those verts. Let's just hold Shift and get a proper thickness that kind of roughly aligns with the vertical segments down below. I think that matches pretty well. Let's see. And then if we E and extrude these straight down, S, Z, and 0, G, Z, snap to the bottom. Yeah, we didn't really need these edges in the first place, so we'll get rid of those. Control R, scale those in Z, and then snap them up top and fill. Okay. Now we've got our cross section finished. Let's select it with L, E to extrude back, Control L, and Shift N to recalculate normals. All right, that's a pretty cool window. And we've got it mirrored, so yeah, that's looking great. All that's left on the first floor is, let's see, some window sills. Let's see, on the wall segment, we don't need this middle edge anymore. So let's select that face, Shift D to duplicate, SX, give it some thickness, a little wider than our window, and then move it out in Y, E to extrude back, Control L, and move that up. I just want to eclipse that bottom face of the window intrusion. There we go. Control L, Shift N to recalculate normals. Maybe move that out slightly. Okay, now for the top, let's see here. If I just duplicate the edge here, Shift D, let's move it down slightly. E to extrude, and just we'll move it straight up and then scale out and ballpark how even that scale is. I think that looks pretty good. Control L to select the island, E to extrude out. Let's give it a lot of thickness, and then Control L, move the whole thing back in Y. And the same kind of thing, I like to eclipse just a little bit so we don't have any Z fighting. Shift N to recalculate normals. Now we've got a nice sill up top and bottom. It's a little thick on the top perhaps. GY, let's move it backward a little bit. Cool. We'll get a nice contrast with our sills being concrete and the walls being brick. So now all that's left is to create space for a door. All right, so on our beveled corner, let's cut another edge, maybe slide that out. Where's our human reference? Let's bring him down. Just kind of set him in the doorway. And that's going to be, I think, a decent door height. E to extrude that in. Get rid of the middle face. All right, now we've got a set of stairs, or space for stairs to go. Yeah, I might as well create that while I'm thinking about it. Similar to the windowsill, we'll just duplicate a face. We'll scale it in local X. Remember, now we're hitting X twice. Scale it out. E to extrude. Wait a minute. What happened here? Oh, I didn't use local axes. So yeah, you can see how weird that is if you're not on top of it. I also know what happened is when I scaled without clipping enabled. So enable clipping in the mirror modifier SXX and then GYY. Okay, E, and we'll extrude that back. Let's just snap it GYY to the corner there. Need to come out a little bit more, GYY. Just like I did on the skyscraper, I can cut edges to become our stair treads and risers, but actually, unlike the skyscraper, it'll make it a little easier if I only do it on a flat plane. Let's say 4 edges in both directions. Select our unnecessary verts. Select the plane EXX. What? GXX? That was weird. Delete the faces. And we can do that same scaling to the corner. Set as the active element S0 M by distance. Should have done that also before extruding. S0 M merge by distance. Okay, so that is a finished set of stairs. Shift in to recalculate the normals, and they're kind of steep, aren't they? Let's select them, select this corner vert, and SYY. There we go. It's a little more natural. I want to give our door a little bit more depth, so we'll select that face, GYY. Hopefully now you can see that without setting up our local orientation properly, it would be kind of a nightmare trying to make some of these adjustments, like modeling the stairs at the 45-degree. You know, there's multiple ways to go about something like this, but I think this one's a pretty intuitive approach. All right, the only other thing I want for the first floor is like a covering, an awning, I guess, over the door. So let's select this vertex here in the center, Shift S, cursor to selected, and in edit mode, I'll hit Shift A and let's add a UV sphere. And for the segments, we'll have both segments and rings, so 16 by 8. And now when we scale the radius, if we just hold Shift and bring that up, I just need 1/4 of this sphere to create the awning. So we'll delete the bottom half, Shift L to make sure I don't select any of the walls, or maybe just select our sphere, Shift H, and now select the bottom, and then half at an angle. Whoops, didn't do that very well. And I never deleted the bottom half. There we go. Alt H, and now we've got a little awning. I think that's what those are called. And then maybe I'll just add a little decorative bump out here to give the illusion of depth. There we go. So that's going to be it for the first floor. Moving on to the second floor, I usually like to put a separator object in between, at least between the first floor and the subsequent floors. So I think I'll create that from our second floor proxy object. Shift D to duplicate that. In edit mode, let's scale it down, make it a little thinner, snap it here, and then I'm just going to push out these two faces with Alt S, just so that it eclipses the columns on the first floor. Let's fill that bottom face. Okay, I don't like this Z fighting, so let's select everything, Alt S, push it out slightly. Okay, just a little bit on the sides and much more on the front. Okay, now onto the second floor. I think we might as well use the profile and the modifier setup from our first floor. So Shift D to duplicate, right click so we don't move it, tab into edit mode, and we can delete everything except our top verts. So all of this can go. And now if we E to extrude and then snap to our proxy, we can delete the proxy, select everything on our new second floor, Shift N. Although I think this should all be moved up a little bit. There we go. Select these 3 edges here, and we're going to bevel these to become our windows. So I'm going to space those out, Control B to get a decent window width. All right, so I think I need to redo that because the space in between windows is further than the space between. There's a couple ways to do that. I could scale down in X and then scale by individual origins and kind of do that back and forth until I get a decent margin in between. All right, let's say that's good. Wait a minute, why can't I cut an edge all the way across there? Let's select everything, M, and merge by distance. I don't know why I can't cut an edge all the way across. Oh, okay, so there's a face on the back of the column. That's weird. Is that how it is down here too? No. Okay, I see, because it had faces on the top there and on the bottom. Okay, that was a weird artifact, but now it should be nice and fixed. Okay, now I can cut edges all the way across, scale up to get a window height. I think that looks good. And now we can E to extrude, give our windows some thickness. More than that though. GY. Okay. And now for the window frame and cross sections. Let's hit Y to separate or split this mesh from the walls. I'm then going to Shift D to duplicate that and hide it, because that will be the glass part of the window. And now this, I can I to inset for a frame, Control R, cut an edge down the center, 2 edges horizontally, and we'll scale each of those flat vertically. Select those new cross section edges, Control B, and we'll bevel those out just a little bit and delete the window pane section. All right, so let's select that window frame, GY, move it forward, Alt H to bring back our window glass, and then extrude the window frame. Select everything with A, Shift in, let's make sure we have correctly oriented normals, and then I just need a windowsill object just like we did below. And remember, I'm using global coordinates, just GY one time, whereas GYY would be local. So that's the difference when I'm focused on the side versus on the corner here. E to extrude, and just slightly crossing over the bottom of the window inset, just like that. Control L, Shift in, duplicate that above. And the only difference with this one is I'm going to scale out the top in X to give it a decorative little taper. Yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. Now I can select the windowsill objects, the window frame, and the glass. Actually, before I do that, let's remove the window here. All right, so window, glass, window frame, windowsill, upper and lower. And then in vertex selection, let's make sure that the active element is one of these borders of our window frame right there, okay? Because when I duplicate and snap with the active element, Shift D X, I can snap that right there to the interior of the window inset. Shift D, Control, there we go. Our first floor is taking shape very well. I need to add a window to the center over here. Let's see, we've got a space to extrude inward, but it's going to be a different size than our other windows. So let's see. I'm going to delete this face and try to source our window elements from over here. Let's select them, Shift D, Shift Z, and turn off our mirror modifier for now. RZ, 45, and negative. All right, and I'm going to try to align this, GXX in the local. This is another situation where without our orientation set up initially, this would be very difficult. All right, so I'm trying to align, if you didn't catch that, the center cross frame of the window. I'm just trying to get it as close to the center of our window intrusion as possible. All right, and now I have an idea where to snap these verts. GXX and snap there. However, I need to cut horizons of symmetry in all our window objects and then delete half. Okay, so now Alt H, or no, not Alt H, return our mirror function. Oh, I have a little bit more to delete, but then I should be able to put all these elements into the center. GXX. Okay, now it's clipping, so we know it's perfectly symmetrical. Very nice. So that is the first floor. Oh, except what about the back of our building? So the first floor typically doesn't have much. And also I'm trying to think in terms of the overall project. You know, the first floor I don't think needs much. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave the first floor plain because I'm not expecting to really see that. I expect to see the back of the upper floors though, or it's much more likely. So it's smarter to put windows on the upper floors, but I might be able to get away with nothing on the first floor. You know, once we assemble our city, if I notice that and it's a problem, then I can come back and fix the asset. But I'm going to try to cut this corner and, you know, try and get away with that. But for the rear facing sides of our building, I think I'm just going to create a simpler window rather than the fancier window. Typically, the fanciest parts of the building face the street, and everything that faces the alley is a little more simple, a little more underwhelming. So it also gives us a reason to have a variety, which is a good thing, especially when we will be repeating so much through this project. So let's cut a couple more windows. Let's we don't need quite as many either. E to extrude, Y to split, Shift D will become our window glass, I to inset, cut a vertical and a horizontal cross section, Control B. You should know the drill by this point. I think I will give it a windowsill though. Okay. Now I can delete, oh, I forgot to extrude this one. EX, let's just snap it there, delete that face. Alt H, make sure everything's visible. And I can duplicate this. Make sure we select a vert on the border of the window, Shift D, X, or Y, and snap right there. Okay. Now we're done with the first floor. And we could do an array modifier to this. In fact, I'll do it for example. We don't want it in X, but in Z. All right, and we can do this as high as we want. I actually want to keep this corner building on the smaller side. Or do I? I thought I would, but now that I see this, I kind of like it a little taller. All right, let's go with 3 rows. However, for variety, I'm only going to make it 2 counts, and then duplicate and make the top floor a little bit unique. Okay, so I'm snapping by active. I need to snap by the closest. There we go. And this will not have an array modifier, but it will be slightly taller. And also, what I want to do is E to extrude this out and snap it. All right, let me just do it first, and then you'll see what I'm doing. All right, so you can see how the columns become an intrusion, kind of frames our upper floors. I think that's a nice little detail, little change up in the structure. Ooh, I should do that over here as well. And we don't actually need these verts. Nice. That's a pretty cool building. Next, we just need a roof. It makes the most sense to duplicate our separator here, Shift D, snap that. And I want to give it a little bit of a decorative piece of molding on the front sides. The sides that face the street. Remember, that's always the fanciest. So I will duplicate these front faces, Shift D. Let's scale them in Z slightly. And then extrude them out. Right click, Alt S, we'll push them out. And then bring up the bottom edge. That could be enough, but I want to give it a couple more levels of decoration. Let's see, I'm going to delete these side faces so that it just gives me an edge on the bottom. And then if I cut a new edge a little above the other one and then GZ, move it down and snap, it kind of gives us that stair step. So I think I'll do that top and bottom. There, that's going to be good enough. And then I can fill in that face. And then let's just inset the top, just like we did on the skyscraper. Always give it this extrusion inward. And I think that's going to do great as a corner building. Let's add materials to our new corner building. Let's switch to the shading workspace. I can hide our reference collection. Let's re-enable overlays in the viewport. And we should have all the materials we need for this building, except maybe for the overhang, this canvas covering. That will probably need its own material, but for everything else, I can create material slots and plug in what we know we want, like the brick material in slot 1. Let's add another slot and add the concrete material. Slot 3, what else do we need? Painted for things like windowsill and the door. And then also we'll need a glass material. I can't remember which one I put on the skyscraper. I want to say the emission for the potential of a night scene. And then we'll go to our first and second floor object. Shift click on our bottom floor, which makes it the active object, adding to our selection. And I can Control L to link materials to incorporate the same materials. Do the same thing for the upper floor, Control L, link materials. And then these objects, the roof and the separator, they just need the concrete, I believe. And then with those selected, Control L and link materials. Okay, now I can start adding colors through vertex colors. Let's start with the bottom floor. Tab into edit mode, and I'm going to select just our walls, hover over and hit the L key. And let's paint these a standard brick color. So vertex paint. We also want to create and maintain a color palette. So the skyscraper A, by default, it seems has the fake user, or maybe I enabled that. Either way, it's going to be saved, so we can remove that one, meaning it's just removed from the user interface, but the data block is saved in our Blender scene. Let's create a new one and copy our residential corner A title. And I should quickly rename our objects as well. And then back to our first floor. And vertex paint mode, let's pick a standard brick color, which is like a dark orangey, slightly desaturated. Shift K. Yeah, that looks pretty standard. Ooh. We have an issue with our brick texture. Yeah, big time. Oh yeah, look at that. Okay, we'll need to fix it. But I like this brick texture, this brick color. So let's add it to our palette and do the same for the upper floors. Okay, so now we can see the extent of our brick texture error. So we need to fix this, but I'm going to split our window so that I can also look at our roof access building. All right, that's in our standalone assets. Let's hide everything else. Roof access. And I want to focus in on that in the bottom window, just to ensure that as I make these changes, both are affected positively. So the problem is, remember, if we look at our material settings, for the brick texture in the mapping node, we rotate it in Y 45 degrees. However, for this object, our new corner building, we've rotated in negative 45. So they're kind of fighting against each other. And there's a couple ways to solve this. I could alter the rotations of our object, but there's a more global solution that includes using that global UV object we created. Where did I put that? In our utilities, right here. All right, so if we go back to our brick material, I'm going to duplicate our texture coordinate, which is using the object coordinates per object that the material is applied to. But if I choose our global UV object for this upper texture coordinate and plug our object there, it's going to use the exact same brick orientations for each object. So nothing really changes on our small building, but our large building is improved, but not completely. It looks good on every side except our flat corner. But if I simply change this Y 45 degrees to negative 45, it should solve it all the way around. Yeah, our brick texture looks good all the way around, and it still looks good on our roof access. Excellent. So we can get rid of our roof access. I mean, not delete it, just hide it. And go back to adding vertex colors. Let's assign a gray color for the concrete to our separator and roof. Let's see, we have this leftover color swatch that looks like a warmer concrete. What if I switch that to a cooler concrete, just ever so slightly? Shift K. think I like the warmer a little better. Make that a little bit darker. Okay, let's add that to our palette. Also assign it up top to the roof. Shift K. Yeah, that looks good. And also we have the top face of our roof. Vertex paint. Let's just make it a darker version. Whoops. Enable face selection masking. There we go. And let's go back to our brick because we have a similar issue with the gradient where I need to adjust each object's texture space. So I'm going to select these 3 objects, and in their object properties, under viewport display, I'm going to hold Alt and click texture space. That will turn texture space on for each object as long as I'm holding Alt. And I'm going to make them all essentially have the same texture space. So with the first one selected, let's disable auto texture space, and I'm going to scale it up. Essentially, I want the gradient to stretch from the bottom to the top. So let's adjust the height and just get it close, bottom to top. Same thing for the second one. There we go. It's pretty subtle as a gradient. So let me look at our soft light. Is that this one here? Yes, so I will increase that. Let's try 0.8. Yeah, I think all the way up is too high, so let's go to 0.8. There we go, a nice sweeping gradient, the entire height of the building. And now let's add colors and appropriate material assignments per mesh island. So let's select all our concrete bits, and we will assign the material, then assign a color. We should have a lighter gray for the concrete. And I think I'll go piece by piece and assign the same color and material to each one to try and make this go as fast as possible. Don't forget the sides of our building. Oops, forgot to assign the concrete material. Next, we'll go to our window color. And for easiest selection, I'm just hovering over the mesh islands, hitting L. And it is a little bit annoying to do, but take your time, and it's not difficult or anything. Let's choose a light blue, not fully bright, nor fully saturated. Shift K, and also assign in edit mode our glass emission. And we do not want our emission strength on right now. Might need that to be a little more blue. Let's change the saturation to 0.5. Shift K. Yeah, I think that looks a little better. Do the same thing for our other objects. While I'm at it, I'm going to select everything and turn off the texture space. Alt clicking to turn that off for all our selected objects. Whoops, I forgot a window up here. And also, the door, I think, looks a little bit plain without a window. It's not very inviting. Feels more like a back door. So I'm going to select this object, Y to split it, and then just cut a little window in here. I to inset slightly, and then just push it in its local y-axis, GYY. Let's delete this face, and then crush this into the horizon of symmetry with GXX. Okay, now I can assign a window material here, along with the color. There we go. That's more inviting. Let's also assign a painted material to everything except the window. Let's see, while I'm at it, let's select our window frame. I think that's it. Assign painted, and then for vertex paint, let's go with a black, maybe full black. Ooh, whoops. Can I undo? No, I can't. I forgot to add the blue color to our color palette. So if that happens and I want the exact color, I just need to switch to solid mode and make sure we have flat shading and no cavity enabled. All right, now I can just hover over in Vertex Paint, hit S. Is that right? Let's turn off overlays. Okay, so there was an overlay. With overlays off and hit S, you can see that we're back to our 0.5 saturation. So I can add that to our color palette. And then we wanted a dark color like black. Let's just desaturate it and say 0.1. I try to avoid pure black if I can help it. Back to Vertex Paint, re-enable overlays, and let's paint that color, Shift K. See what that looks like in Material Preview. Yeah, I think that looks good. So we'll add that to our color palette. And then add the black paint to our other floors. And then that only leaves this material here that's going to become a fabric material. So let's see if we can get away with a concrete material first. Let's assign concrete. Let's see, let's also give it a more vibrant color, maybe a red. So over to Vertex Paint. Let's see what a red looks like. Maybe a little darker. Shift K. Also, I need to right-click in object mode, shade smooth, and enable in object data our normals auto smooth so that this becomes smooth instead of faceted, but everything else stays faceted and hard-edged. All right, I think that looks pretty good, though I don't know if I like the black door. I don't know. I'm going to think on that for a minute. See, I do think the concrete steps... Oh, I also need to make this concrete so it blends in with the steps. Vertex Paint, let's select... Let's see, I'll add the red to our palette and then choose... Oh, but I want a darker concrete for the stairs. Maybe even darker than that. I just think that since those get used more, they're going to be darker. It also varies up the concrete. You know how I feel about variety. All right, so this looks pretty good. There's just one more thing I want to try. So if we switch over to our Unsplash images, remember our main reference is this darker brick, which is common to see the front facades of brick buildings painted a different color than the rest of the building, going back to that theme that the best of the building faces the street. Now, I don't know what the backs of these buildings look like, but we can see in a couple other photos that it is common to paint the bricks different colors. So here the front is painted a gray while the side is actually a light blue. Here in this building it's painted very dark and we don't know what the brick is. On this building it's a different style brick on the front than the side. But the theme being the street facing side of the building is often different. And I like to use this to our advantage in the project because it gives us a reason to introduce more colors. And here is a good example of the street-facing side being a totally different material than the rest of the building. And so I do want to try that. And we'll follow the theme with our main reference for that darker, almost navy, but mostly desaturated. So let's start with our first floor, tab into edit mode, and select our bricks again. This time I'm going to hit C to bring up circle select. Yikes, I've not had screencast keys on the whole time, or they were on, they just weren't refreshed. So C, circle select, middle mouse click and drag to deselect the back sides. That will remain the typical brick. Shift L to deselect our stairs. And let's choose a new color in Vertex Paint. Let's see. It's towards the blue color, but we want it to be fairly desaturated. Let's try 0.2 in saturation. Value needs to be pretty low. Let's see what that looks like. It looks nice. Maybe a little too dark. Yeah, I think that looks a little better. What if we switch the lighting HDRI? Yeah, I think that looks good. Generally speaking, I want the theme of our city to be colorful and not drab, but that doesn't mean we can't make a building with a darker color scheme. Of course, variety of all kinds is going to be beneficial, and I do like how the dark looks. So let's apply that to our other floors. Same way, select the whole wall, deselect with circle select, and then I might need to go to wireframe to avoid painting the windowsills. Same up top. And then back to material preview. Yeah, that looks really good. Let's take a look at our edge highlighting. So we've got edge 1 down to about half. Let's see, I want to pull that up. Let's pull edge. Don't feel like I'm seeing much difference though. And that's a crash. Blender 3.2 has been a little less stable than I'm used to. Way more crashes. But I hope I have an auto recovery. Let's check our auto saves. All right, that's from the same minute. Oh, but this is actually a duplicate of the scene that I've had over to the side for reference, so bummer, I can't use that. Let's try another one. Okay, that's going to be good enough. I think I just need to add that dark navy facade. All right, so I'll do that quickly one more time. Yeah, I think I'm all caught up now. So I'm going to save the scene. And where was I? I was adjusting our edge highlighting. That's right. Make sure I do that on the brick texture. I noticed that I wasn't seeing much effect because I was adjusting on the painted material right as it crashed. Okay, so yeah, to the brick edge highlighting, edge 1 is kind of turned down. So let's turn it up. What about edge 2? All right, let's turn it on and off. Hope it doesn't crash. Let me save it. Control S. M. Okay, yeah, I think that looks good. Okay, I think that's going to work for this corner building. I think it's very chic and clean, but you can imagine there's several ways you can color these buildings. You could color the inset of brick differently. You could make it something like stucco instead of brick. You could paint the upper half a color, the lower half a different color. So be sure to embrace the concept of variety and explore different combinations. And to show this, I've created a few other buildings and imported them into the scene. They were created using the exact same process, but subtle variations like the style of window frame, the colors, adding these simple awnings over the windows, and then this little detail on the corner bevel. Same workflow, producing a very different building. This is another style of corner building that doesn't have a beveled edge, but it has entries on both sides, so it would fit great on the corner. And then you can also get a little more ornate, adding these bay windows on the corners, a unique shop front in between the corner doors, some nice little corbels up top. Again, all using the exact same approach, and we've got several building types to add to our city. Now, there is one thing I forgot, and it was the canvas material. I think I just added concrete to it, which is not the final result. That's not going to be close enough to a canvas. It's a little too reflective. So I am going to create a new slot and duplicate our concrete, and we'll call it Cubicity Canvas. So anything with an awning can feature this material. And really all I want to do is turn the specular all the way down. Let's apply this to our canvas awning so we can see what the material changes. And I want to take our sheen value all the way up. All right, if we turn that on and off, you can see it adds this kind of soft felt Fresnel effect that will serve nicely as a canvas fabric style material. We can get rid of these nodes here because they're plugged into the roughness, but since we have no reflection, they are inconsequential. And at this point, we have finished our corner buildings. Next, we're going to model a parametric building. So far, both buildings we've created are static, meaning they're not easily adjusted. They are what they are. So if we were to duplicate this around our city assembly, they're going to be obvious duplicates. We also can't change any features easily, like let's say I wanted the skyscraper to be 3 stories taller or twice as wide, or same thing for our corner building. Those things cannot be achieved without duplicating and making destructive, time-consuming by-hand adjustments. And this is where the idea of a parametric building can be a huge boost to a library of assets, where you can change the number of floors on the fly, you can change the width, you can even toggle on and off certain features, or randomize the colors per duplicate. And so I want to show you how we can create a simple parametric building using, drumroll please, modifiers, because they're still entirely relevant for a task like this. I am so sorry. Ignore that guy. Let's try this again. With geometry nodes. That's right. Because you and I are both cool, we're cutting edge Blender artists, and that is how we're going to create a simple parametric building. So in this first video, I want to break down the pre-made pieces that I built ahead of time. I know that's disappointing that I'm not recording it in real time, but when I rehearsed it, it was going to be another 20 to 30 minutes of the exact same techniques with just a few of the most minor adjustments. So I figured I'd save us some time and just describe those few unique things, like the fact that it is a row house, a brownstone. It might help if we look at some reference. Here you should be able to see that the first floor is usually slightly unique, with a door at the very least, where the upper floors are basically the same thing repeated both vertically and horizontally, and they can be quite large structures. In fact, if we look at some of these other ones, here's an example of both how wide it can be, and the windows are duplicated all the way across, but also this new feature of a fire escape. That might be something we want to add. This also shows just how duplicated the windows appear, a perfect candidate for a parametric building. And then, yeah, look how many windows are identical. I mean, in reality, these structures can be enormous. We're not going to go this big. I'm going to keep them smaller in general. But the parametric potential gives us the option to create a much larger building than our one-offs have been so far. And so hopping back over to Blender, all I've built is the essential elements to create the much larger structure. And to start going over some unique features, as a row house, the side I want to be extremely flat, especially on the corners right here. So I'm not taking the decorative crown all the way around the corner, or with the floor separator as I have been in the previous video, kind of giving it some thickness all the way around. I'm not doing that because when the parametric setup is complete, they're going to be duplicated exactly side by side. And I don't want any faces overlapping, except for the windows. I added windows just in case we want to use it on a corner, so it's not just a plain flat brick wall. But these will be intersecting with each other, but since they're in the middle of the wall, we'll never notice. But again, every feature that is along the border and corners, I want to be perfectly flat in the x-axis. We have just a few objects. The first floor, let's open up our outliner and make sure we see how specific the naming is, but we'll get there in a second. So we have a first floor with everything combined, the stairs, windows, they're all part of the same object. Also, the separator up here is part of the first floor. Then we've got the second floor, or what will become every subsequent floor. And there is a slight separator that's intersecting the roof piece. Now pay attention to the object origins. So if I select the first object and reveal our item location properties, notice the XYZ values as I click each piece. So the only thing that's changing is the Z axis. Object origins are identical in X and Y, only the Z is changing, and they're changing by specific values. So it's important to mind the height of floor 1, which is 0.8 meters. That's going to be a number we want to remember. Then the second floor is 0.6 meters tall. That's another number we want to remember. And then the third number is the width. So if we look at the X dimension of floor 1 and floor 2, they're both 1.56 meters. But that takes into account the slightly extruded window sills, which I don't want part of the number. And so to tell what the real number is, if I duplicate this and move it forward, tab into edit mode, and just select the corner vert, Control I, and delete everything else. And now tab to object mode, we can see the actual dimension that I want to stack our duplicates side by side is 1.5 meters. All right, we can delete that object. So we have the 3 values we need to remember. And lastly, let's talk about our naming conventions. So I'm keeping everything about this building in the residential parametric A CG Cookie collection, but then underneath that, I have another collection that contains all of the parts. That's important because geometry nodes will source the objects specifically in this collection. And I simply tried to shorten the prefix res for residential, GN for geometry nodes or parametric, and then copied that shortened prefix where the first floor has a 0 in front of it, which represents the index of this object within the collection. The second floor has the 1 index, and the roof has the 2 index. So I recommend using this naming convention. It's going to be a lot more intuitive once we set up our geometry nodes. But hopefully you can tell that this is an extremely simple model to put together, which is why I didn't record how to do it. Of course, there's limitless possibilities for what type of building can be applied to a parametric setup. I recommend just following the instructions first with these parts so that you can understand the concepts first and then, potentially apply it to a unique building of your choice. So with our parts overviewed, let's create the geometry node setup. The first thing I'm going to do is split our window so I can have access to the geometry node editor. And I'll hit the N key to temporarily hide the N panel. Same thing in the 3D view. We don't need the tool panel or the N panel, at least not yet. And to start a geometry node based object, I'm just going to create a plane. So Shift A, mesh plane, and we'll move it kind of off catty cornered to our parts. Give it enough space. And I'm going to move this into our residential parametric A collection outside of the parts collection. That's important. Then copy the name and paste it. All right, and in our geometry node editor, let's click the new button, and I will also paste the name there. Maybe add a GN at the front for a geometry node prefix. All right, so the way we're going to start our instancing of the parts is we need a piece of geometry to source vertex positions. And I like to use a mesh primitive. By the way, Shift A is the same hotkey in the geometry node editor. So I'm looking for mesh primitive and mesh line. Now, if we Control right click to break the geometry, we get a blank object. And now if we connect the mesh line to our geometry output, we can see that mesh line. Now, what you cannot see is that the count here says 10. That's the number of vertices going vertically in the z-axis every 1 meter. So if we take that down to 1, then we only have 1 vertex. Take it to 2, and you have 2 vertices for a smaller line. So the idea with this mesh line is simply to use the vertices for instancing the parts of our collection. All right, so we're going to instance. Let's hit Shift A, go to the Instances menu, and choose Instance On Points, not Instance To Points, Instance On Points. All right, let's plug that in. It takes the mesh output, plugs it into the points, i.e. the vertices. And now we need to tell it what type of object to instance. As I've been saying, we're going to source parts of the collection. So Shift A in our input type, let's choose collection info, which is where we can choose that res GNA parts CG cookie. All right, now if we plug this into the instance, we're going to get the entirety of our collection duplicated along 2 vertices. Remember, we have a count of 2. So we really only need 1. To start this off, we're just going to focus on the first floor. So I need to specify this first object in the collection. So let's enable separate children and reset children. Okay, reset children basically clears the transforms, which is how we're going to stack our objects dynamically. And again, I want to specify which object. So we're going to enable pick instance. And it looks like by default, it picks the first in the collection. But to make sure we know what we're doing, let's add an input integer, no decimals. So let's hit 0, and that will pick the first object. Remember, when it comes to computer counting, it starts with 0, not 1. So that's why I recommend we name these intentionally. All right, so these are all the nodes we need for our first floor. Let's select these nodes, and then with Node Wrangler enabled, you can hit Shift P, which will add a frame node around our selected nodes, and I'm going to call this Floor 1. Let's change the color. Just to try and keep this nice and organized, we'll make it blue. And now I want to select all of these, including the frame node, Shift D to duplicate it. And we will modify this setup to become our second and above floors. So let's rename the label to be Floor 2 Plus. We'll change the color to like a green. Now for this one, we want an integer of 1. That's going to be our second floor object. But we need to combine these with a Shift-A geometry join geometry node. And that gives us a big node socket, which I see as like a wide open door for many geometry outputs. All right, so now we've got our first and second floor combined on the same location. We don't want that. Instead, we want to raise the second floor by the height of our first floor. All right, so if you don't remember those values, let's select the source object. Let's look at our properties, and it is 0.8 meters tall. All right, so back to the geometry node object, and we can change the start location in Z to 0.8. And let's increase the count to simulate, a much taller building. So it starts at the right place, but we don't have the offset value correct. That is the height of our second floor object, which is, I've already forgotten, 0.6. All right, so let's change that in the offset, 0.6 in Z. All right, now we have the vertical height dynamically set up. That's excellent. Let's duplicate all of these, move them down, and this will be the roof. Whoops, what did I just name the roof? The wrong node. Let's choose the frame node and call it roof. And we'll change the color. Now this one is going to be integer 2. All right, let's plug this into our join geometry node. So we've got all three. And I'm in the habit of shift control clicking for a viewer, but the viewer doesn't seem to do anything. So we'll just keep it going to the geometry output. All right, now we've got the roof. It's being duplicated multiple times. We just need a 1 count. And we need to adjust the start location and the offset. However, it gets trickier because we are dynamically changing how high we want to place the roof. So we need to use some math so the roof dynamically adjusts with the height of the overall building. And this means we need to extract our values so that we can reuse them. And I can do this with a value input. So Shift-A input value. All right, these are decimal places which can be used for the start location in Z and the offset value. All right, so I need 2 of these. So how do we plug them into the start location, which is a purple socket, meaning a vector? You can't plug them in directly. You need to add a vector combine XYZ, which does expose the individual sockets. So we can use this. Let's copy the Z value for the start location and paste it in our value node, which can't have the M for meters. So let's just delete the M and plug that into our Z value and the vector into our start location. Nothing changes. That means it's good. And let's duplicate the combine XYZ. Do the same thing for 0.6. So 0.6, that goes into the Z as well, and that goes into the offset. All right, now we've got our exposed values that we can use to mathematically adjust for our roof segment. So let's think this through. I need to move our roof segment up the height of each floor segment, all right, which was 0.6 times the count right here, 3. So we need to expose the 3 as well. Let's go to our Shift-A add menu and choose input. We'll use integer again because we can't have a decimal point as count. So we'll change that to 3, plug that in, and we want to take that 0.6 value and multiply it by the count. So let's add a utilities math node, change the operation to multiply. We'll take the 0.6, plug it into one of the sockets. Let's do the bottom one. Shift, right click and drag just to show that they're coming from the same place. You really want to keep these organized because it can become a mess quicker than shader nodes, honestly. And then I want to take our integer count, plug that in here. But we're not done with the math because we want to add the height of our bottom floor. So that 0.8 value, we want to add, let's duplicate the math node, change it to add as the operation, and we're going to add that 0.8 value. Okay, now we can take all of this. Well, I need to plug it into a combine XYZ node. Let's just make enough room. Whoops. There we go. Make sure we have all the reroutes, all the nodes selected. Duplicate the combine XYZ. And this will go in the start location, I think. Yeah, perfect. You saw it jump up to the top. And this means that we can change the height of our building and the roof follows it. Excellent. The only thing left for our basic setup is horizontally duplicating everything. And so we can use the same mesh line trick, but instead of using a collection geometry output, we're just going to use the output of our join geometry node. So everything gets duplicated along the mesh line. Let's just duplicate this whole section here, Shift D. And to keep it organized, let's rename to horizontal array. And change the color. Slide that into the middle here because we can get rid of the collection info, shift right click, add a reroute node and plug that reroute into the instance. Then connect the instance's output to our geometry. And oh, I want to disable pick instance. We also don't need the integer. And so here we don't want to go up in Z, we just want to go horizontally in X. So let's change the X value to 1, which is going to be wrong. The count, let's increase. So this is where the 1.5 value, remember that's the horizontal dimension of our objects, just to confirm that. Remember we did the whole 1.56 and then showed that it was actually 1.5. So I do think it's important to make it more intuitive to use intentional numbers. You know, you don't want like 6 decimal places. I mean, you can do that, but it's more convenient to use smaller numbers. Either whole numbers or like 1 decimal place. At least that's how my brain works. Anyway, let's go to that X value 1.5. And now they perfectly line up on the side. And we can increase the width of our buildings. We can also increase the height. Where is that? Oh yeah, our count value over here. And that is the fundamental setup for a parametric building. But there's a few more features I want to add in the next video. Something you may have noticed at the end of the last video is that our gradient component is broken. So if we bring back our corner building, remember we love these bottom to top gradients on virtually every asset in our Cubicity library. But when it comes to our geometry nodes, it's doing the same thing that the array modifier did. It's a gradient per object rather than the final evaluated model. And so the first thing I want to do, let's click on our geometry nodes object, and we want to add a realize instances node. So Shift A, instances, realize instance. And you'll see that our gradient changes. In fact, it almost completely disappears. And as far as I understand, realize instances kind of presents our individual geometry node components into a cohesive final object. This doesn't affect our ability to change our height or width. All those dynamic parameters are maintained, but I guess the attributes are sort of combined. I liken it to applying the modifier stack or collapsing a bunch of layers in Photoshop. But the idea here is for the gradient to not see individual components, but the entire object. So let's set up our workspace a bit better. I'm going to split our panel on the left so we can see the shader editor. And I'm going to select our source object and then pin the brick material. So select slot 2, pin that. This way when I select our geometry nodes, it keeps the material even though it's not applied to this object. And I want to shift control click on the gradient texture by itself. And you can see that it's been relegated to the very bottom of our object. And if we turn on in object view display properties, texture space. I have no idea why, but that's our texture space after we realize instances. If we mute realize instances, it's this, for some reason. So my goal at this point is to do the same thing that we've done with our corner building, where we manually adjusted the texture space, which doesn't work here. I can't disable that for the geometry node object and change any of this. You can see it has no effect. So we have to adjust this in our geometry nodes. And the first step is using a geometry bounding box node. So we can grab our realized instances, plug it into our bounding box, and that will create a dynamic bounding box that still follows along as we adjust our parameters. However, you'll see that the gradient seems to have disappeared. But if we add, let's just search material, set material, and then choose our brick material, you'll see that we get the gradient exactly how we want it. So wouldn't it be great if we could transfer these UVs back over to the realized instances version? That is what we're going to do, but this gradient is a mystery. If we look at our texture coordinates, it seems to be coming from generated, but I have no idea where that generated data is stored. If you're watching and you know this answer, please inform me in a comment, because I just spent 3 hours figuring out how to do this and could not find where that generated data is stored. However, I do know that if we plug up our bounding box to the output geometry, and let's split our window over here and bring up the spreadsheet. Okay, funky error. I don't think that matters. But if we look at our face corner domain, you'll see that we have this UV map. Mind the spelling and case sensitivity. But if we plug up our realized instances, we have a UV map, which is the default UV map that's created for mesh objects. You can find that in the object data. So this tells us that the bounding box generates new UVs on the face corner data. Now remember, the goal here is to transfer this UV map data to the UVs of the realized instance. And to do this, we have a Shift-A attribute transfer attribute node, which requires that we specify a specific attribute. So Shift-A in input named attribute, we can plug anything in here that we find in our spreadsheet. All right, so if we go back here, remember that's UV underscore map, all lowercase. So let's type that, UV underscore, and it should show up here. Note that it is a 2D vector type, so let's click UV map. It changes to vector, and we can plug in the attribute to this attribute, except note that it is a gray socket. So by default, the transfer attribute is float. We want it to be a vector, which is UV data. And now it turns purple, and we can plug in that attribute. So at this point, we have the attribute ready to transfer. We just need to tell this geometry to accept that data. And we can do that with an attribute store named attribute. Okay, so we'll take that geometry of the realized instance into the geometry socket for storing a new attribute, and that attribute is going to be UV type vector. And what is this point? Oh, it needs to be the face corner domain as well. And let's plug in the attribute to the value. Now we have the ability to name a brand new attribute that's storing these UV vector coordinates. So I'm just going to call this GN underscore UV for geometry node UVs. And then plug that into our geometry output. Okay, now in our spreadsheet, you can see we have GN UVs that should be transferring, but we don't see that yet because we have to set it up in our shader node editor. All right, so at this point, it's a little confusing how to do this because you can't use an input UV map for this. If we click on that, you'll notice we only get UV map. We don't get this GNUV option. Instead, we have to use an input attribute. But you can't use this attributes category, which conveniently grabs things like our color attributes. So you manually have to choose attribute and then type in GN underscore UV. All right, and since we have a vector socket output, we can plug that into, let's see, we'll put it directly into the gradient texture for now. And if we rotate around our object, we will see that we are getting something. So we are successfully sourcing and transferring those attributes of the bounding box UV over to our realized instance. But this looks nothing like what we hoped it would. Remember when we were using the generated for our bounding box, it was from bottom to top, perfect. Well, that's not what we're getting here. So I need to manually manipulate the UV vector coordinates. Let's make some room here. With the vector separate XYZ, and then immediately add a vector combine XYZ. Now remember, these are 2D vector data, and in 2D, Y is up. And so what I want to do here is use Y for all of these sockets. All right, now you might be able to barely tell, but we do have a gradient, very subtle, going from bottom to top. So we can add a color ramp to adjust our gradient. I'm going to switch it to, let's see, constant first, and I just want the top of our building to turn white, and then go back to ease as our interpolation method, and then pull up the black, and now you can see that we get that gradient. But in the transfer process, it is dependent on your vertices. It's not like the generated coordinates, which is independent of the amount of vertices. So that's a little bit of a limitation with this method, but in the end, it's going to look fine. So if we shift control click on the principled BSDF, you can see that as we adjust the gradient, it is applied to our material, and we're getting that nice sweeping gradient from bottom to top, which is great. However, it's kind of broken on objects that aren't geometry node based. So we need to create another condition that only implements this custom UV data for geometry node objects. And we'll do it the same way as we did for isSmall. We'll do it through a vertex group. Or I'm sorry, I'm still not used to calling them color attributes. So we need to do this on the source object. Let's hit the plus key, and we will name this isGN. And it needs to be face, corner, byte, color, and color swatch all the way up to white. And we'll hit OK. Let's make room for this. We'll duplicate our attribute. Or this is the kind of attribute you could add from input attributes isGN. All right, so if we shift control click on the color, you'll see that our non-geometry node corner building is all black, whereas the first floor of our geometry nodes building is white. Let's go ahead and add that to our second floor as well. isGN. Okay. So we can use this black and white toggle essentially as the factor for a color mix node. So our purple sockets are vector data, which is 3 values, X, Y, and Z. Our color is also 3 values, RGB, and they're interchangeable when it comes to mixing vector coordinates. All right, so we can take, let's see, the vector of our custom UVs, we'll plug it into slot 1, and then our generated into slot 2, and the color from our isGN toggle attribute into the factor, and then plug the color output into the vector of our mapping node. Although we haven't really been using the mapping node, I want to be using the mapping node because I want this toggle to pipe into the mapping regardless. So let's plug that into our gradient texture, and we should have to adjust our geometry node values. Let's shift control click on the gradient texture. That's not what I was expecting. Let's think through the logic here. isGeometry node means we want to use this attribute. I need to switch the color swatches. Okay, now we get the gradient on our geometry node object, but also getting the gradient from our texture space adjustment on the non-geometry node object. All right, so our conditional color attribute is working well. However, you know, our gradient is different because we're piping it into our mapping node, which we weren't doing originally, so I need to adjust our color ramp. The biggest problem, in my opinion, with this setup is we get this kind of awkward fall off at the front of the building. I don't really know why that's the case, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to be a huge deal. So I'm just going to massage it till it looks nice, but I want to make sure using constant that the top of the building is just barely touching the white. There we go. Okay, so now we should be adjusted correctly. Let's see what it looks like in the final material. Excellent. You should be able to tell that gradient is involved. We can turn that on and off. Very nice. It's also maintained on our original corner building. So it might have seemed like a simple task, but in my experience, nothing with geometry nodes is simple, but it is rewarding to figure out a problem like that. The last thing to do is add that isGN color attribute to every object that it's relevant for. But also we can add these nodes to the various materials involved. All right, so it's these three. Control C, we can copy them and then unpin this material and paste it to the concrete. Control V, mix in the generated coordinates to the mix node, just like that. And you should see all of our concrete incorporate the gradient as well. Yes, excellent. Onto the glass emission. And then the painted material. And something to keep in mind for any other building I will build, or if you build them, you'll want to follow the same conventions so that these same materials can be used over and over again. And I think that painted material is a little bit too strong. Yeah, it's the factor of the soft light is up to 1. Let's go to like 0.5. I think that was too low. Let's go to 0.7. There we go. So now our gradient is fixed. And next I want to show you how we can add balconies and fire escapes that can be turned on or off at will. I think it would be a nice feature if we could add balconies to the front of our building and fire escapes on the back that could be toggled on and off at will. And so to achieve this, we're going to need additional pieces for our parts collection. So let's focus in on our source pieces, and these will be relevant to our floors object. So it makes sense to duplicate from here, Shift D, right click to cancel any transformation. And let's rename this appropriately. It will be part 3, and it will be balconies first. So just balcony, and remove the numeric value at the end. As you'll notice, by default, each collection is sorted in order alphanumerically, which is convenient. All right, so we have a duplicate of our floor object. Let's think about what the floor of our balcony would be made of. I think concrete makes the most sense. So let's hit L to select one of our window sills, and then Shift Z to move it towards the front. All right, as we crush it into the horizon of symmetry, we get that nice clipping, and then I'm going to GZ and snap it using vertex snapping to the bottom so it connects nicely to the first floor and every subsequent floor. And then we need to extend the front, GY. I think that should be enough for imaginary people to stand on. And then let's duplicate with Shift D our top face to create the banister or railing. I'm not sure the difference, but let's use the I inset key to create a thickness for our railing top. Let's delete these faces and actually the center face and just crush this vertex into the horizon of symmetry and this vertex to our wall. Looks like the other one needs to come forward into our wall as well. And now this can be extruded. Well, actually, we might as well get rid of everything that's not part of the balcony. Those are redundant duplicate pieces. And now we can extrude this down with E to give it some thickness. And then we'll duplicate this face, Shift D, Control R, and cut an edge slightly towards the outside, and then remove the other edges. And this we can snap to the bottom, E to extrude, Control snap to the top, and this will become the vertical segments of our railing. So we just need to Control R and cut an appropriate number vertically on the front and an appropriate number vertically on the side. They don't have to be perfectly proportional, but you know, just good enough to the human eye. And then we can select these edges, including the corner. We're going to bevel them, Control B, just give them a little bit of thickness. Switch to face selection with the 3 hotkey And then Control I, we're going to delete all the negative space or negative faces. By negative, I mean in between the edges we just beveled. And then Shift L to deselect the top banister and the floor. X, remove faces. All right, we need one in the center. Shift D and move it over in X till it crushes the horizon symmetry, and that's about the same thickness. All right, so A to select everything, Shift L to deselect the top and the floor. And now we can E to extrude, right click, Alt S to push that in and give these some thickness. Let's turn on our overlays for the face orientation and see what's incorrect. And there's several pieces I didn't know about. So let's just try selecting everything with A and Shift N. That works there. Select those windowsills, Shift in, and then for the floor, the roof, select everything, Shift in. Okay, now we're clean and our normals are facing the correct direction. How about some materials for our balcony? Let's turn off face orientation. And the top piece and the bottom I like being gray concrete, but in the center, I want those to be painted like our windowsills. So A to select everything, Shift L to deselect top and bottom, and make sure that we're on our COL vertex color attribute. And we need to source that teal color. So we'll go to solid view and make sure we have flat and, okay, attribute is correct. Oh, this object is on isGN. So whatever color attribute is selected over here, that's the one that displays in the viewport. Let's select COL. Make sure we don't have cavity enabled. All right, now on our banister, go to vertex paint, S to source this teal color, and then Shift K, make sure we have selection masking enabled, Shift K, there we go. But then also I need to assign the material. Let's see, we should have a couple materials we don't need at all, like the brick and the glass. And so now tab into edit mode and we will assign painted. Excellent, that's it for the balcony. We can duplicate this. First, I'm going to snap the cursor to the selection. Let's use our cursor as the pivot point, and then Shift D to duplicate, right click to cancel any transforms, tab into edit mode, select everything, and I'm going to SY -1 to scale this negatively to the back side. I use scale because I didn't want to rotate it, which would put it on the other side. But scaling it does flip the normals. So if we re-enable our face orientation, I need to Shift in, flip those back properly, and then we can turn that overlay back off. Maybe go to solid view, or maybe not. It's just kind of dark back there. What if we just switch around our HDRI? There we go, that's good enough. So let's think through the difference between the balcony and the fire escape. It needs to be a little bit thicker, or rather there needs to be more depth, so it needs to extend from the wall further to make room for the ability to walk around a set of stairs. And so let's just eyeball how this needs to go. First thing, we'll pull this flush with the wall, G, Y, and snap along an appropriate vertex. There. Maybe even bring it out a little bit more, imagining a set of stairs fitting here. And then let's see if we can just duplicate a set of these banister railings. Shift D and Y. Let's just get them close. That's going to be good. Now, to make the most sense, you want to put a fire escape near a window. And right now our windows are exactly opposite of that. So, let's just go ahead and move our window object, or the window portion of our mesh island. Let's just move it over in X. We can use our median point as the pivot again. There we go. And now it'll make it easier for our balcony to encompass that. Okay, we need to duplicate a few more banister pieces. Shift D, move them over in X. Okay, I think I'm going to undo that. I didn't need that many. Let's just do 2. Okay, and then I'm going to have to, I guess, duplicate one more and then maybe scale these a little bit in X. Let's make this our active vertex choose active element, SX. There we go. That's pretty even. Even enough. Let's adjust our materials. We don't need any material except metal. And then as far as color, we can just change everything to a dark, very, very dark gray, almost black. Completely desaturated, Shift K. All right. So that is going to be the balcony, or let's just call it the fire escape platform. Remove the numbers at the end. And I'm going to duplicate this to become the ladder segments as well. So Shift D, right click, we'll rename that to fire escape ladder. And it is number 5 in the list. Tab into edit mode, and let's figure out how to build this. I don't think we'll need a mirror modifier, so let's get rid of that. Let's just select these 2 verts, Control I to invert and delete everything else. Select those 2 verts again. I'm going to move them to become the side of our stairs. I'm going to extrude them up and snap them to the top of the floor object, bottom of the roof. That's pretty important for them to, you know, array properly. And then we'll move them over in X to create the slant for our stairs. All right, now I want to leave enough room. Remember, if you're imagining people walking up these stairs, they need to, at each floor, walk around them. So there needs to be space on the front of the stairs and then on the back of the stairs as well. So in other words, I don't want to put the stairs all the way to the side. There won't be any room for people to walk. You know, it's not terribly important, but it does need to make enough sense for plausibility, even in a stylized world like this. So I think that's going to be pretty good. I might make them a little bit wider. All right, select the island with L, and then E, we'll give them some thickness. Control L, Shift D. All right, this is the support for our stairs, and I think that's going to be just enough room for people to walk and get around. I might snap them to the front of the banister. There we go, a little bit more room. Now for the actual stair treads. Let's select these 4 verts, Shift D, F to fill, and then Control R. These will become our treads. Let's see how many that is. It looks right. I think anywhere between 10 and 14 should be fine. So let's go with 10. Do the same thing as the banister railings. Select them all, Control B, give them some thickness, Control I, Shift L to deselect our frame, and now we can delete the faces. Whoops, I should have first switched to face selection mode, then Control I to invert, Shift L the frame, X, faces. Okay, then let's select our tread faces again, just A, select everything, Shift L to deselect the frame, SY. I'm sorry, it's going to be SX, but we want to use individual origins. SX and 0 will set them all flat. Let's move them in X slightly. EX. There we go. Now we have our stairs. Let's take a look at the face orientation. Select everything, Shift in. Okay. All right, that looks good for the stairs. We just need to Control L, link in object mode the materials from the platform. And then let's see. Okay, so it has the correct material, but not the correct vertex colors. So over to Vertex Paint, we can turn off selection masking and Shift K to paint that black. Turn off face orientation. And that is our fire escape. Oh, except we forgot the hole in the platform that accepts people going up the stairs. All right, so let's duplicate temporarily our ladder, snap it to the bottom of the next one, exemplifying what the array would do. And, you know, actually, I think I was wrong. I think I can Control 1 to go to our back orthographic. I think I can actually scale these. Oh, look at that. That's not flat. Let's scale all of these according to an active element at the front, because we don't need that much room behind our stairs. All right, so that should be enough right there. The reason being, now if we Shift D to duplicate and snap it down here to the bottom, the whole reason I'm snapping it is to cut a hole. Let's see, what's the best way to do this? Let's go to solid view and go to studio mode and material. There we go, back to gray. So I need to cut the hole and it needs to be asymmetrical. So in object mode, let's apply the mirror modifier. Tab into edit mode, Control R to cut some new edges. GX, snap it there. Control R, why won't it cut vertically? Oh, there are faces in the center. Creating non-manifold geometry. GX, let's do that again. Now it can cut like that. Just making room for a hole. The stairs did seem a little steep to me, but now they make sense where people go up. Well, they're going down the stairs. So down the stairs, around, through the hole, and down the next set of stairs. Okay, we can get rid of that temp duplicate. And there's some parts that are really white. Oh, they need the is small attribute. All right, so in our color attributes, is underscore small, face corner byte color, and white. Okay, there we go. That's much better. Same thing on the platform, is small. It's better. I wouldn't say it's much better. I don't know, maybe... it's fine. It's fine. The gradient is also going to be propagated to all the duplicates once it's plugged into geometry nodes, but still, these are a small object, so it makes sense to add that condition. Okay, now we're ready to incorporate these pieces into our geometry nodes network. I think we can get rid of our shader editor. Let's select our geometry nodes and think about how these can be incorporated. You know, the balconies are going to be exactly the same as our floors. Okay, so we can, let's make some room. I think all of these objects will be incorporated through this method of floor to plus. So let's select this frame node, Shift Control D. That will maintain the incoming connections. And then I just want to clean this up. So Shift, right click, and drag to create some reroute nodes, although we need to cross two noodles to merge them together. Whoops, I want to be careful not to include these reroutes in the layout node. So just make sure your mouse cursor is not in that layout node. I'm sorry, frame node. All right, and then we need one for the count as well. Like that, I hate when that happens. Just a matter of keeping your mouse out of the frame node. Okay, now we are cleanly duplicated. I think much more evident where the noodles are going. And we can rename this to be balconies. And since it's related to the green, but not exactly the same, we'll just keep it close to a green color, but slightly different. All right, so the balconies is going to be the integer two, let's see, what is it? 3. All right, now when we plug this into our join geometry, we have balconies. That's very easy to implement. However, I said I want to be able to turn these on and off at will. And there's a node we haven't used yet called utilities switch. If we plug that into our outgoing geometry noodle, all right, we can say that if it's false, meaning it's unchecked, then it gets the false socket, which is our balconies. We want the opposite. We want to move that to true. And now whenever we turn the toggle on, that's when we get our balconies. Okay, that's easy enough. Now for the fire escapes. The platforms will be exactly the same as our balconies. So let's make a little more room. Duplicate all of these nodes, Shift Control D. And actually this gets a little confusing. Let's cut these connections and then reconnect them. All right, let's rename this to a slightly more cyan, maybe a lime green. And this is going to be fire escape platforms. All right, this is integer 4, yes. They're incorporated exactly the same way as our balconies. Let's just move this down. All right, we have all our platforms, also toggleable. Now the ladders need just one extra bit of math, but they will start as yet another duplicate. So let's just move these down slightly, make enough room for this. Shift D. Yeah, I will just manually connect these back up rather than using Shift Control D. Let's rename this to Fire Escape Ladders. We'll keep the same color since they are very related to each other. All right, and this is integer 5. And let's plug that in. And see, the problem with this is the top one. We don't need a ladder going to nothing. All right, the ladder can stop one integer below the count of our floors. All right, so all we need is to take our count value here and subtract 1. All right, so let's add a couple reroutes. Let's move them off to the side, add a utilities math node, change the operation to subtract and the value to 1. And then when we plug that in, we get that working beautifully. And that is it for our geometry nodes setup, except for the convenience of finding the right nodes that we want to control our parameters. Right now they're hidden in this fairly large network. I mean, let's be honest, it's super small considering what geometry nodes can become. But even in this simple setup, it's kind of cumbersome navigating around to, oh, this is the count where I change the horizontal value. And then all the way over here is the one I change the height. So the last thing I want to show you is how we can access these attributes outside of the node network. And that has to do with the group input node. So let's think about what we want to control. The height of our building, the width, and the toggles for if we want balconies or fire escapes. So we want this value right here, the count. So if we drag this empty socket into the green reroute node, and then look at our group settings, we see this new input. We can change the default to, I don't know, let's say 3. And then the min, that can be 0 max. I don't think I want this to be higher than like 10. And we can name it height. And now, if we select our object and look in the modifiers panel, we have that height setting. So we can change that to 3. Very convenient to have it over here and not rummage around for it in the node network. We can get rid of that integer if we want, or leave it there for, reference. Now let's grab the horizontal width. I'm just going to duplicate this green reroute node because it's way over here. We could maximize the view, but it's kind of hard dragging this socket all the way over. Well, actually, I guess it could be done. Anyway, the reason I duplicated the reroute, specifically the green one, is that whenever I plug it up over here, nuts, I hate dragging those into the frame node. It will stay green once I drag it over here. Otherwise, it'll be a gray input rather than a green one, and I don't like the inconsistency of that. So now, with that established, I just want to reroute our noodle around into an intuitive fashion. Once again, I hate dragging it into the frame node, but if that happens, you can hit Alt-P, and that will clear it from the frame node. All right, so back to our in panel, let's rename it to width. And then for our toggles. So the first one, we want to plug into this switch value right here. We'll take the empty socket, drag it all the way to the switch, and let's just reroute this node. Let's rename it to toggle balconies. I mean, I guess it doesn't need the toggle. The only reason I would want to add it, if we control space to go back to our regular user interface, the balconies, it's not actually a check mark. I don't know if this will happen eventually, but right now it's a slider between 0 and 1. Let's see, we need some width. And now you can see the balconies come on and off. It's a little weird that it's a slider, but that would be the only reason I want to add the word toggle, but I think I'll leave it off. All right, so the balconies toggle is set up. Now this other one can actually share an input. All right, so I'm going to duplicate with Shift D this purple reroute, or pink, I guess. Let's drag in our empty socket. Let's reroute it. I guess that's one too many. This will go in here, and then it will also go in here. All right, so this last one is fire escapes. There's no reason to have two toggles for those, even though they're separate objects because of that specific math. They can be turned on and off at the same time. There we go. Now let's double check our settings. You want to be clean with this. The width, I didn't set a default value. Let's say 3 there as well. Minimum, I think 1 needs to be a minimum. Actually, for the other one, it needs to be minimum 2. Let's say 15 for the width. And for the height, yeah, I said the minimum could be 0. It needs to be 1 at least. Now for balconies, let's see. Default is checked. That's good. Fire escapes, let's also turn those on. And that should be it. I mean, you can add tooltips if you want, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory in a simple example like this. So we can change the height very easily. No need for the graph editor or the geometry nodes editor. And we can turn on balconies. We can turn on and off fire escapes. So I know this is a very simple example, but hopefully your brain is firing with ideas of how you can implement your own parametric buildings as we go. But we are almost done with our parametric building. There's just one more thing I want to implement. Next, I want to look into color randomization, because it's powerful that we have these parametric buildings which can be duplicated and the height can be adjusted, the width. We can make it skinny and tall. We can turn off balconies. We can turn off fire escapes for a particularly unsafe building. But the colors make this a clear duplicate. And so if we can add the ability to automatically randomize this per object, that would be a very useful feature. So let's switch over to our shading workspace and select the first floor source object, specifically the brick material, because that's going to be our most noticeable shift. And we're going to affect our vertex colors. So Shift A, let's add a color hue saturation. This node allows us to adjust the hue, the saturation, and the value, how dark or light it is. Now to adjust this on a per object basis, we need a Shift A input object info. At the very bottom, we've got that random socket. And if we click on that, or rather Shift Control click on it, you'll see that our objects get a slightly different gray color, though it's very slightly different. But trust me, they are different grays. And if we plug that into the hue socket, Shift Control click on the HSV node. Again, they are different magentas, but quite similar. And I think if we duplicate these again, then we will start to see that they are very different colors. But a problem that I have with the random socket out of the box is that they are more similar than they are different. You have to duplicate several times to get a green, for example. Out of 6 duplicates, only 1 is notably different. So what I want to do, back on our source object, is add a converter math node. And I want to change the operation to logarithm. And right away, you'll see that we get very different colors on all 3 duplicates. Now, if you're wondering why logarithm works, I cannot answer that. This is a case of clicking on a bunch of different operations till I found one that sort of did what I wanted. And I apologize to the mathletes out there who are wanting to shake me and explain to me how this math works. Please do so in a comment if you know. I'm always open to learning something new. But in this case, I'm primarily more interested in progressing through my art project, and sometimes trial and error is an effective way to do that. So yeah, we're going to go with logarithm because it also has this base value, which we can use as kind of a seed value, so to speak. But the 0.5 level is a good place to start from. Now, what if we plug this randomized value into hue, saturation, and value? Now, I do recommend you wait for this to compile before dragging these noodles because I've experienced several crashes from that. But once we plug that in, we're getting some pretty intense colors. Now, I don't really want them to be that intense. So I want to add an option to essentially choose the default value of the HSV or the randomized version, which sort of serves as an intensity parameter. And the way we're going to do that is by adding a color mix RGB. And first we're going to cut these noodles and look at our default values. Hue is set to 0.5. So the color 2, or no, let me think this through. Color 1 needs to be this value. So value of 0.5, it's that by default. And so the randomize goes into slot 2. Okay, so now when this goes into the hue value, if I take it all the way up to 1, that's purely randomized, and all the way down is the original. All right, so let's take that up to 1 because I do like the hue shift at full strength. Next, let's use this same technique, except we want to mix in value 1. So this needs to be fully white in color slot 1. Let's make this a little bit cleaner. Also make room for one more. This goes into the saturation. Let's see. Whoops, I meant to put that in color slot 2. There we go. So now I think I would want this by default to be something like 5. Or maybe even less. Pretty low, 0.06. But of course we're going to adjust that. Let's duplicate one more time. Didn't quite have enough room. And this is also going to be 1, the value. Now we have individual control over the sort of intensity of these effects, of the randomized effects on these parameters. So this is a decent level of control. However, remember that the facade of our building is the most brightly colored portion of our building, and that's what we really want to randomize. The backs of the buildings are a standard brick color, so it would be nice to randomize them a little bit so they don't look identical, but we don't want them turning yellow or green brick. And so we're going to introduce another condition in the form of a color attribute. So let's add is_random. It's a face corner. It's a byte color. Now the default color I'm going to set to a value of 0.4, unlike the white value of 1 that we've used previously, because think about how much of our building needs the full force of the randomization. Really only the facade, so a small part of our building. So the majority of the building will get a 0.4, 40% of that random value. All right, so let's hit OK. And now we'll zoom in on our source object, go to Vertex Paint, and let's switch to Solid View. All right, so I'm gonna use Space Selection, L to select the entire wall segment, except looks like the windows are still part of that. Let me just separate those real quick. Selecting each face, hitting Y. Now it'll be easier to select the walls. Go to Wireframe, B, Box Select, middle mouse click and drag, and deselect the back or regular brick section. And now we've just got the facade highlighted. So Vertex Paint, let's switch to white for full force of the randomization. Shift K. Looks like there's some saturation. I don't want that. Shift K. All right, we'll go back to our material preview and the brick material. And in the HSV, there is a factor slider to globally control how much effect this node has. And that's going to be perfect for us to duplicate our attribute node and select, or rather type in is_random. As always, make sure you have the name exactly right. Color goes into the factor. And that, let's see. It doesn't seem to be quite right. We're still getting slightly greenish bricks over here. All right, let's go back and check our color. Go to Solid View, Control I to invert the selection. Is that 0.4? Let's change the value to 0.4. Shift K. No. How bizarre. Okay, so you saw me set the default color to 0.4 when I created the isRandom color group, but clearly it was not. That's an interesting discrepancy. So I guess we need to rely on filling it in Vertex Paint with the proper color swatch, not trusting what the color attribute creation modal gives us. Okay, now let's check out the effect. Yeah, so from behind there is a slight variation in the brick colors, but on the front it should be full effect. Let's see, we'll select the second floor and do the same thing. We'll add an is random color attribute. You know, it's set to 0.4. That's so weird. Let's go to vertex paint and just turn off face selection masking. Shift K to paint everything 0.4. And then in edit mode, let's do the same thing. Select the walls. Oh, I got to separate the windows again. Sorry, I thought I had done this, but clearly I had not. Select the walls with L. Wireframe B box select to deselect the back. And the facade portion gets fully white. Face selection masking enabled. Shift K. Now let's see in material preview. There we go. The facades are fully randomized, very brightly colored, but our brick remains mostly the same. So really all that's left is to package these nodes, these randomizing nodes, into a convenient node group for copying to other materials. So with them selected, let's hit Control G and let's pull out some important parameters like the base value. Let's plug that into our group input. And in the in panel, in the group tab, let's change the name to be seed. I don't know if it technically qualifies as a seed, but it functions well enough that way in my opinion. And now for the min and max value. Actually, yeah, I do need to figure that out. So I'm going to tab out of the node group edit mode. And let's see a seed value of 1. Okay, so this does create a pretty intense issue where that logarithm operation is pushing the values way above 1 and it's registering as light being emitted from the color, and that's being picked up by the bloom render setting. So what if we go to 0.9? Okay, that is manageable. So seems like maybe 0 to 1. 0 looks pretty good too. What about 0.1? Yeah, okay, so 0 to 1, let's make that our range. Although I should check, does it help to go into the negative values? Well, should have checked that before I changed it. Okay, no, I don't see any effect going negative. So yeah, 0 to 1. And then also as a safeguard, if we add a color mix RGB node to the end of our node group and simply mix the color with itself and enable clamp, that will force the values into a 0 to 1 range so we don't ever have to worry about those bright artifacts. And so that should be good for the seed parameter, quote unquote. Let's also grab the factors for these mix nodes. The first one controls the hue, second one controls the saturation, and the third controls our value. Excellent, so that should be it for our node group, except we need to adjust the name of the node group itself. So cubicity underscore HSV randomizer. Let's select that, copy it, paste it to the name properties data block down here, and then for the label HSV randomizer. And now we can copy this. Let's move it into a more reasonable position. And we can paste this to our other materials, though the seed at 0 is pretty weird. Let's go back to 0.5. Let's also look at our final material as bricks. Yeah, that's going to look really good. Excellent. I love that the bricks are just slightly different on the backside too. And how about we paste this to the concrete material to get a little bit of difference in that per object as well. So slot 1 for concrete, get rid of the color attribute node, Control X, Control V, and it does remember the position from where we copied it. Let's move that back down, Control C, and we'll plug that into the color. Now let's see if we can tell our concrete is changing. Okay, it is changing. Wow, it happens really quick. Okay, so we don't really see any effect until we get into the really high values. Then it's pretty intense. So I think what's happening is that the concrete is kind of gray by itself. So it already doesn't have a lot of values for the logarithm to work with. And then on top of that, in the isRandom color attributes, we are lessening that to 40%. So it might make more sense to actually increase the concrete is random value to fully white. So let's test that with our roof piece here. And we'll add is underscore random, face corner, bite color, and the color all the way up to 1. All right, back to material preview. Okay, yeah, so that is definitely picking up our randomized values. So let's change the seed back down to 0.5 and find something a little more subtle. You know, we want it to be subtle like the brick on the backside. We don't want it to be brightly colored. A little bit of color I'm fine with. What about saturation up, value up, maybe value down? Ooh, okay. Yeah, I kind of like that. Let's duplicate a few more. Oh, it does get dark. I like that. Although, look at these 3 buildings. They're pretty much the same. Let's duplicate one more time. That's interesting. Maybe I just switch the seed on our brick material. See if we can get them a little more randomized. Okay, so I need to go back onto the isRandom vertex attributes. I don't need to go to solid view. I can do it in material preview, but add a white value for all our concrete portions, because I do think that needs to be white in order to receive the full effects, since it's already gray and prone to lesser effects anyway. Yeah, that looks pretty good, though maybe the values are a little too intense for the concrete. I don't want it to be black. There we go. Nice and randomized concrete. So yeah, we can add these to any of our other materials, like the painted material would need it. Also the windows, I wonder if it would benefit to at least have different values, maybe not different hues. Would be weird to see like a red window. But the process is, or the conditions required, we need to copy the HSV randomizer node. Let's add it to the painted material. Anything we want the potential to be randomized, which, I mean, we don't even have that many materials, so probably everything. And for our painted now, let's see, I'm thinking it might also need the full effect of the randomizer. See, on the first floor, everything is still kind of that blue, navy blue color. Let's see, we'll change the seed to like 0.6. It is affecting it, but it's just not very strong. So yeah, I think I'm going back on the idea I had to paint everything 0.4 gray. It might have been smarter to paint everything white and then only do the bricks, the backside bricks at 0.4, but anyway. All right, so yeah, once I have the randomizer node applied to the material, we just need to make sure we have the isRandom vertex color attribute, and then we can control how much the randomizer affects this with the value we paint in vertex paint mode. So let's go with 1, Shift K. All right, that shifts very much, and we can see that effect on our duplicate buildings. Yeah, I think that looks good. And so I will need to be diligent and kind of do a pass on all the materials that need the randomization. But the last thing I want to show you is, what about our one-off buildings, our non-parametric buildings? Can they benefit from the randomization? Yes, they can. However, there is a catch. So the object info node is per object, and that works great for our geometry nodes. Even though the source parts look random and kind of hideous, whenever those get piped into our geometry nodes, they see this as one object, so it works perfectly out of the box. But if we apply that to this object by just adding an isRandom at fully white, we're going to get that same very ugly rainbow style building. And so if I want to randomize one-off buildings like this, I can't have them in separate pieces, which stinks because I like to work non-destructively. The fact that we can keep all these neat and organized in a collection. But if I want randomization, I have to combine all these objects into one. And so the way I like to do this, because I don't want to get rid of the non-destructive quality altogether, is I'm going to duplicate this collection. And then I'm going to rename this one with an underscore edit at the end. And in our buildings, I can add a new collection and we'll call it buildings underscore whip. Or wait, I just changed that. Buildings underscore edit. Edit or whip, it's the same idea. But take every edit collection and put it in there. We can turn that off. Just for safekeeping, if we ever for some reason want to change something about this building, we can source it from here. But as for our regular collection, the one that will eventually make it into the asset browser, I'm going to select everything, object, convert to mesh first to collapse any modifiers, and then Control J to merge it together. And now it is being randomized but unified. However, we're getting those bricks on the backside purple. Oh, I should have actually painted the isRandom before I combined it. So let's undo that before we apply our modifiers. Okay. All right, now we've got our modifiers back, and I should go ahead and paint the vertex groups, vertex color attribute as I want it. So the backside is random. I want to make this 0.4. There we go. Same thing all the way up. And then let's run through that one more time. Object, convert to mesh, and then Control J to make it all one. Okay, now when I duplicate, they're different each time. Now I should say that for the one-off buildings, I don't plan on duplicating them too much. You know, I need to be more aware that they will be more noticeable when duplicated compared to our parametric buildings. But it is still nice to have that randomizer affect our duplicates automatically. Now it looks like our canvas material definitely needs the randomizer node. There we go. Nice. And of course, since it is a darker facade, we're going to get less punch in the colors. But overall, I think this works well. The concrete still maybe is a little too strong. There we go. It's a little more balanced. But at this point, that's it for the randomization. I still need to do a pass on all of our objects, so things like the cars can be randomized, or even the HVAC units can be slightly different metals. Basically do an audit of all our objects and anything that I want to be randomized, because that will benefit duplication. The last thing I want to go over before we begin assembling our city finally is the emissive component relevant to a nighttime scenario. I've been alluding to this the entire course, but I thought it would be cool if we could essentially flick a switch and everything that would emit will start emitting for a fairly easy transition from daytime to nighttime. And I've been setting us up for this by using this Cubicity glass emission material for everything from traffic lights to car headlights to building windows, and also the neon signs that we created. And that's where I want to start with the neon signs. So I'm going to hide the parametric parts of our building because that's at the center of the world. And when I re-enable our standalone collection and the hotel sign, we will be able to see it. Now, the main way that we enable emission is to select the neon object, and then in our glass emission settings, let's take emission strength up to, let's say 20. And if we turn off our overlays, now we can see what this would look like at night. And so one of the first things I need to decide on is sort of a ceiling for the emission strength, because not all of our objects will emit the same. I want the sign to emit fairly brightly because the brighter we go, the more bloom our object has. So, I mean, honestly, 50 looks pretty good, but it does depend on the color of the light. What about 30? Let's go with 30. Of course, we can kind of dial this down after the fact, but when I say ceiling, I mean that the sign will be the brightest emitting object. And obviously the windows for our buildings do not need to be this bright. Let's say if we have that to 15, maybe even 10, that's a little more reasonable for a soft glow of the windows. And so let's go back to, I don't know, I'm between 20 and 30. How about 20? All right, between 20 and 30, either of those. And you'll notice that I don't have randomization set up for our sign, which might make sense because if this was a sign for, I don't know, Jim's Deli, there's not going to be multiple Jim's Delis in our little city assembly at the end. And so it makes sense to leave that a unique, non-randomized object. However, I've created fairly generic signs from hotel, theater, and parking that it would make sense to randomize these for the potential of using them multiple times. So I want to set that up. Also, it will kind of introduce us to some of these components we need to be aware of balancing randomization and the emission. And so first thing, in order for it to be a randomized object, we need to collapse the collection into a single object. But first, I want to duplicate our collection and rename the duplicate underscore edit. I then need to create a standalone, a standalone underscore edit collection where I can throw all of these editable versions of these assets. Just like we did in the last video, we can hide that standalone edit collection. And now all the objects within this hotel sign collection, let's select them. Let's see, all of a sudden I forgot how to do that in the outliner. I thought it was hold shift. Okay, yeah, that's right. And Control J to join them into one object. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, that worked out fine because there was no modifiers, I guess. But really what I should have done, let's undo that. I should have gone to the object menu first, convert to mesh, and then Control J. Let's copy the name from our collection, paste it there, and move this to the standalone collection and remove that unnecessary collection with X. Okay, so now we've got our single object hotel asset, Alt D to duplicate left and right to show that they are not randomized. So let's introduce randomization. Let's turn on our overlay so I can see which one is selected. And in our color attributes, let's add a new one, is underscore random, face corner, byte color, and the color is white. All right, we only add these to objects that we want randomized. It's one of our conditions. And you should have seen that the painted material on the hotel letters changed, but our neon light did not change. So I need to copy, let's see, the HSV randomizer from our Cubicity painted material, Control C, jump over to the slot with the glass emission material, get rid of that vertex color attribute, Control V, to paste our randomizer, and this goes into color 1. And now our lights are randomized. However, I want to turn saturation all the way down and value all the way down. I don't want any randomization in the saturation or value because I want all of them to be very saturated and very punchy, also fully bright. Whereas if we introduce saturation, some of the lights turn to white and the value also some get darker than others. So just turn those all the way off. We only want the hue randomized, and then we can, adjust the seed to get a variety of different colors. And so this is working for the sign. However, when I zoom out and we see our buildings that also have the isRandom color attribute, we see that they've not only shifted from our former blue color, but they're all over the place. We've got green windows, we've got yellow windows. So we essentially need to tell the windows to only be a little bit random, not fully random, in other words, white, but just a little bit. And so if we tab into edit mode on these, and I just want to make sure, I don't think they are linked duplicates. So if I move this face, yeah, it doesn't work on the other ones. So I need to select them all, Control L, and link object data so that when I add, vertex colors or manipulate them, it will be shared between all these objects. And so tab into edit mode. Let's select all our windows, maybe go into solid view so we can see our isRandom color attribute. And yes, our windows are white. They're fully randomized. And we want to change that. First, we want to select the windows. Let's go to our Cubicity Glass Emit material slot and choose Select. It's an easy way to grab those windows. And then over to Vertex Paint. Let's change the value to, let's try 0.5. Shift K, make sure you have selection masking enabled. Now when we go to material preview, there's a little bit of randomization, but they're mostly that blue color that we wanted originally. And zooming out, we can see that that's also true for our parametric buildings, but that's actually dependent on the parts that we hid. That's okay, we'll come back to the parametrics. Let's just take one thing at a time, the sign, and now our one-off buildings, and then we'll address the parametrics. Now, when it comes to our window emission, we don't want a blue color. We want a warm yellowish orange. And so since I'm painting all of our materials in their COL default color group, we're using a very light blue for all the windows, I can simply add a color HSV node or hue saturation node to change the emission color down here. If we shift the hue down until we see a nice warm yellowy orange, that also works for the signs because they're being fully randomized anyway. So it takes all of our blue emission and turns it warm, but since our signs are all over the place, it still works fine. However, there is one problem for any object emitting lights that we do not want their hue shifted. For example, the traffic lights. Let's unhide one of our traffic light collections. And if we look at what is supposed to be green, yellow, and red, they're clearly not that anymore. So we need another condition just on objects where we want the emission value to stay the raw color information from our COL color attribute. Okay, so I'm going to select this object. Let's add a new color attribute and say keep underscore emit underscore color. All right, face corner byte color, color all the way up to 1. Let's add that. And then to plug that into our material, go to the glass emission material, and then Shift A, let's add the new attribute, keep emit color. Shift Control click. Now it is the only one with white, which is standard procedure when we add these conditions. However, functionally, we can use this as a factor for that HSV node to turn it to 0. Essentially, we want to invert this color attribute from white to black. So Shift A, color invert. And then we can plug that into our factor for the HSV, Shift Control click on the final material. And now those lights are emitting and maintaining that information from the COL color attribute. Meanwhile, everything else is still as we want it. So we can turn off our traffic lights. And let's go back to our building windows, because we need to control some windows to be on and some to be off. And so for these one-off buildings, it's nothing fancy. We're just going to add a new condition, a new vertex color attribute called isEmit. And I'm going to change the default color to black this time. And before I paint any white, let's go ahead and plug this in to our material. So Shift A, add that input attribute isEmit. And this will be used to control our emission strength, which we set to 20. So let's add a converter math node, and we'll change the operation to multiply. And either one of these values can be what we plugged in here, 20. And then our color can be used to multiply against that 20. So with everything black, it turns to 0, and we go back to our main window color. All right, it's like all of our lights are turned off. It would also help, since we're dealing with a nighttime scene, to switch our HDRI world environment to be one of these nighttime, not the studio, just this one. I guess that's the only nighttime. Okay, so now it seems like the sky is actually dark. And so from here, I can tab into edit mode. We've got all our windows selected. And really, I just need to select random windows. You know, the pattern is up to you. Don't forget the ones in the back. I think that looks good. Jump over to Vertex Paint. And let's think about the color here. We set that value of 20 for the neon sign to be kind of the strongest emitting object. So we want to, let's try halving it with a value of 0.5, Shift K. And now we see those lights come on. And I think that's a more subtle glow. Oh, that's right. We also need to add the isEmit color attribute for our hotel sign. So this should be pretty simple. Just add isEmit full white They should all come back on. Okay, yeah, so that's full brightness. We can see more glow around the neon and less glow around our window lights. And yes, they're all going to be the same pattern, but we're not going to use these standalone buildings too often in a small area. However, this does bring us to our parametric buildings, and how are those going to function? Because ideally, our lights in the windows would randomly turn on, harnessing the power of geometry nodes, but I humbly admit that after several attempts, I cannot figure out a way to do it. And I'm sure it's possible, I just don't have enough experience with them yet. And so I don't want to leave you hanging with nothing. I will show you a kind of working solution. So we can unhide the parts of our parametric building. Where is that? Right here. And first, what I'm going to do is make all of our buildings turn on, just like it's a standalone building over here. So we'll just select all of our windows, tab into edit mode, select the glass emission to select every face that has that material. And I need to add the is emit color attribute. But first, if I remember correctly, for the is random, we changed that to 0.52 over here. So to keep that consistent, Shift K, and now our windows will only be 0.5 of the randomization. But I need to add a new color attribute. However, as of 3.2, there seems to be a bug that will crash Blender if you add a color attribute in edit mode. So I need to tab to object mode. Let's see. Or just switch to object mode and then add that color attribute is underscore emit. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, so we have an attribute section in addition to the color attribute section. All right, let's stick with the color attributes. Okay, is emit. Okay. We want to make it black by default. Face corner, byte color, okay. Tab into edit mode, and now we can add in Vertex Paint that 0.5 value, Shift K. Okay, now they all turn on. Let's do the same for the bottom floor. Make sure to add your color attribute in object mode. Okay, so we're all set up there. Oh, I need to, you see the windows in the front are red, so for is random, I also need to make that 0.5. There we go. Okay, so now if we zoom out, all our parametric buildings have that warm tone, which we want, but they're all turned on. So how can we sort of randomize this? Well, if we add a texture in here, make sure you're on the glass emission material, Shift A, texture, and let's use a Musgrave texture. Shift Control, click on that so we see what it does by itself. So it's this kind of noise pattern with very distinct black splotches and white splotches. And so let's jump into our object here, and I'm going to use UVs to essentially make our faces use a very small portion of that texture. All right, follow with me and it'll make sense. So if we split this view, make the top one a UV image editor, and with all our faces selected, let's hit U unwrap. Okay, that'll put all our faces in the 0 to 1 space. I'm going to select everything there, and we'll choose individual origins instead. And now we're going to scale our UVs 0.001, so extremely tiny. If the texture were an image, we're essentially using 1 pixel of that image. And so if we use our UV coordinates into the Musgrave texture, you'll see that 3 of our windows are on and the rest are off. And if we change the scale of our texture, that will shift. All right. Now from here, I want to add a converter color ramp and then change the interpolation to, constant. Now they're all off by default, but as we drag down the white flag, you'll see some come on completely. Okay, it looks like the front one, we had to come down quite a lot. Maybe the scale has to be increased, like let's try 10. And then bring this down. Okay, yeah, now you see how they come, some of them start to come on. So this is a kind of hacky way to get randomization in our windows. Now I don't want that transition visible in the windows. So I think maybe if I scale, oh wait, it's working fine on the bottom layer. I haven't done the same UV trick on the top. So let's do that real quick. Unwrap, select them all S.001. Okay, now it's working. It's sort of randomization. You know, you drag the flags up and down and you get random lights turning on, seemingly. So let's see if that's working on our parametric building. No, it is not. And the reason being, if you remember, for geometry node buildings, they're not intuitively using the UV texture coordinates. Instead, if we make this the spreadsheet and face corners, it has a specific name, UV map. So it's using the default UV map here in our object data, and we need to specify that in the material. So let's go back over here to our source object, and I'm going to add, I forget, can I use UV map? I forget if I can do this. Yes, I can. You can either do that or also just use an attribute node and type in UV map. But the UV map by itself is more intuitive since it only has the vector socket. Okay, so now on our parametric building, they're all getting lights on, but they're not random. So in order to introduce randomness, I want to add a vector mapping node, also an input object info. All right, so now we can use that random socket, then add a converter combine XYZ. So we can use the random into all three and plug that into our, let's say, location for our mapping node. Essentially, it's just moving the texture coordinates a little bit per object. All right, so now with all these components, we should start to get a pseudo randomized building light pattern. So let's change the scale to 20. From my rehearsal, I remember 20 being a decent Musgrave texture size, though we are getting partial windows being turned on. It's an imperfect system, but you know, unfortunately, this is kind of the best I was able to come up with. If you know how to turn the windows truly random, please post insight into the comments for this video. I would love to know myself. But you know, for what it is, this should work well enough. Let me play with the scale a little bit. Okay, so now we have a decent pattern of on and off. Yeah, that's going to be good enough. And now I need to use another condition essentially to say if an object is a geometry node object, to use these nodes, and if not, just use the isEmit attribute. So we add a color mix RGB. And for the second socket, we want that to be isGeometry nodes, which we already have a condition for up here. That isGen attribute. So we can add a reroute node, Shift-Control-Click on that, and then reroute it, like extruding vertices, into the factor for this mix node. And now, those nodes should only affect our geometry node buildings, but not affect our other objects at all. Oh, except they're way too bright. So in the color ramp, we want to make that 0.5 value, or you know, dial it into taste, so it looks a little more consistent with the other ones. Oof, I do not like how we can see the transition. I don't remember that happening in any of my rehearsals. Maybe I need to scale the UVs down just a little bit more. So select everything S.001 again. So they are extremely small, and that is not doing anything. Oh, maybe it did on the bottom. Let's try the top, S.001. Yeah, okay. So that got rid of the partial window. So just scale the UVs down super duper tiny. And, you know, we've got a pseudo randomized set of windows for the parametric buildings, you know, randomized in quotes for our standalone buildings. And I think at this point, I've gone over all the conditions and possibilities for our other assets, like the traffic lights you saw a little bit of, which would also benefit from the isEmit condition. So let's look at that real quick. Traffic light double. Yeah, so these aren't glowing anymore at all. Let's turn off the parts of our geometry node building. Okay, so yeah, let's see. I need to add an isEmit, and we'll make them all black by default. And then really only one of the lights needs to be lit up, like let's say the green. And that's usually not terribly bright. Let's go with a 0.5 value, Shift K. Okay, so at least for this traffic light, it's giving the green signal in both directions. Okay, maybe these don't need to be sharing object data. This one, let's make that a single user over here. Or these two should be sharing. Let's turn off our sign. Okay, so I think this is sort of the main street with the most lanes. So maybe this one will be the red light. So let's make that one black. And the red light will be 0.5. Okay, so yeah, this one needs to be linking this object data. They're both green. This one's red. So now the traffic makes sense. But I need to implement this with the car headlights, and I don't think anything else. Oh, the lamps on the street as well. And just anything else, you know, any asset you want to add to this library that is emissive. I think in this video I covered every condition, so hopefully that made sense. Again, you might need to watch this video more than once. I think it's the most extensive conditional material setup. But at this point, I believe we are done and ready to begin assembling the city. Yay!